Welcome, and thank you for being here. Over the next 2.5 hours, we are going to take a careful, guided walk through one of the most consequential ideas of our decade, the case for neurorights. This lecture is based on the expanded 4th edition of the book Neurorights, The Battle for the Last Private Place, by Stefan van der A.A., published in 2026 as part of the TI One Voice initiative. The book is 406 pages long. It is organized into 17 parts and 83 chapters. And it asks a single, almost embarrassingly simple question: who owns your mind? Not your phone. Not your medical record. Not your search history. Your mind. The brain inside your skull, the electrical activity that constitutes your inner life, and the data that can now be read from it and written into it from the outside. 2 centuries of liberal political thought have assumed that the answer to that question is obvious: you do. But the technologies arriving in this decade do not respect that assumption. And the law, in most of the world, has not yet caught up. So that is what we are here for. Let's begin. Before we dive in, a quick word about how this session is structured. We have 2.5 hours together. The book has 17 parts, and we will move through every one of them in order, with brief mental breaks at the natural seams. At the heart of the argument is a set of 5 core neurorights, plus one underlying question that contains them all. We'll define those 5 rights early and we'll return to them throughout. A few ground rules for how I'd like to work together. First, stop and ask. Interrupt freely. Every claim we make is contestable, and that is the point. This is a body of argument, not a body of settled science. Second, stay critical. The book itself is an argument, it is not a balanced report. I will try to mark, as we go, where the evidence is strong, where it is weak, and where it is genuinely contested. And third, take what is useful. The closing toolkit in Part 16 is meant to be practiced, not just understood. If you walk out of this room with one concrete action you intend to take, the lecture has done its job. Here is the sentence the book opens with, and it is worth letting it land before we go any further. Quote, "For centuries, the human mind was considered a fortress, inaccessible from the outside." End quote. That has been the working assumption of moral philosophy, of constitutional law, of every system of human rights ever written. You could be tortured for your beliefs, you could be silenced, you could be killed, but the thought itself, the inner deliberation, the moment of conscience, that was unreachable. It was the one place no inquisitor, no censor, no torturer could finally reach. Even the harshest regimes acknowledged this, sometimes grudgingly. The thought was free, because it had to be. There was no apparatus that could touch it. Neurotechnology changes that fundamental reality. Devices that read neural activity, and devices that write into it, already exist. They are moving from clinical use into consumer products faster than legislation can follow. Take a moment to absorb what that means. The presumption that one inner space was always private was not just a value of the liberal tradition, it was a fact about the world, a fact maintained by the physical inaccessibility of neural tissue. That fact is now negotiable. The presumption now depends on how we choose to build the technology and how we choose to govern it. The question is no longer whether mental life can be observed and influenced from outside. It can. It is. The question, the real question, is now under what rules, by whom, and with what redress when those rules are broken. That is the question the book sets out to answer. And it is the question we are going to spend the next 2.5 hours examining. I'll add one note before we begin in earnest. The book is written for a general reader. It is also written by an author who is, openly, an advocate. The author has chosen a side. That choice is declared in the title. Throughout the lecture, I will mark places where the evidence is strong, where it is weak, and where serious people disagree. I will not pretend that this is a balanced report. It is an argument. The work of weighing the argument is yours, and it is real work. Here is the roadmap. 17 parts. 1 argument. Part 1 lays the foundations, what neurotechnology actually is. Part 2 surveys the international legal landscape. Part 3 is the conceptual heart of the book, the sovereignty of thought. Parts 4 through 11 take us through the deployments, warfare, the targeted individual phenomenon, detection and forensics, ethics, the benevolent uses, the role of artificial intelligence, the wider social effects, and the commercial market driving it all. Parts 12 through 17 turn to governance, a legislative agenda, oversight institutions, the future, what likely sits behind classification today, a set of 15 hypothetical cases, a practical citizen's toolkit, and finally a conclusion. It helps to think of the 17 parts as 3 movements. Parts 1 through 3, understand the technology and the rights at stake. Parts 4 through 11, see the technology deployed in the world as it is. And parts 12 through 17, govern it before it governs us. Understand it. See it deployed. Govern it. That is the arc. Let's begin with Part 1. Part 1. Foundations. Before we talk about rights, treaties, or policy, we have to agree on what we mean by neurotechnology. And that turns out to be harder than it sounds, because the term is used to cover everything from medical implants in operating rooms to wireless earbuds being sold on consumer websites today. Part 1 of the book, chapters 1 through 7, does the foundational work. It defines the field. It walks through the spectrum from non-invasive to fully invasive. And it makes a specific argument that neurotechnology is not merely another digital technology like the smartphone or the social network. It is categorically different. It interacts directly with the substrate of the mind. Spend the next 20 minutes with me here. The rest of the lecture only makes sense if this ground is solid. What is neurotechnology, exactly? The book offers a working definition. Neurotechnology is an array of devices and systems that interact with the central nervous system through electrical, magnetic, optogenetic, or other physical means. It is not science fiction. It is in clinics, in research labs, and increasingly on store shelves. Functionally, it divides into 3 families. Let's go through each one in turn. The first family is neuroimaging, technologies that read the brain. This includes EEG headsets, which measure electrical activity through the scalp. It includes functional MRI, which tracks blood flow as a proxy for neural activity. It includes functional near-infrared spectroscopy, FNIRS, which uses light. These tools observe structure and activity. With modern signal processing, they can infer memories being retrieved, emotions being experienced, intentions being formed, even inner speech being silently rehearsed. A small but important point, the inferring is what makes the modern situation different from the situation a decade ago. An EEG headset that records the same raw signal it always did, run through a foundation model trained on enormous corpora, can now produce inferences that would have required laboratory-grade hardware and weeks of subject-specific calibration just 5 years ago. The hardware sometimes hasn't changed much. The interpretive layer has changed completely. The second family is neuromodulation, technologies that write into the brain. Transcranial magnetic stimulation. Transcranial direct current stimulation. Deep brain stimulation. Newer techniques include transcranial focused ultrasound, non-invasive, targeted at deeper brain structures than magnetic methods can reach. These devices inhibit or stimulate targeted brain regions. They can change mood, motor function, behavior. Some of them treat Parkinson's disease. Some of them treat resistant depression. Some of them, in research, alter memory consolidation. The third family, the one the book treats as the most consequential, is brain-computer interfaces, or BCIs. These are closed-loop systems that both read and write. They are the interactive gateway between the brain and an external device, a phone, a computer, a robotic limb, a drone. When we talk about neurotechnology raising the question of who owns your mind, the BCI is where that question gets sharpest. Because once a system both reads and writes, the system can, in principle, observe its own effects on you and adjust accordingly. That is the structure of a control loop. It is also, depending on what it is being used for, the structure of either a medical device or a manipulation device. The technology is the same. The intention, the consent state, and the governance are what differ. These 3 families exist on a spectrum from non-invasive to fully invasive. Let's walk it. On the non-invasive end, you have devices worn entirely outside the body. Helmets. Headbands. Glasses. Wristbands. Electrode patches. Even, in some prototypes, conductive tattoos applied to the scalp. And, most relevant to our daily lives, a new generation of wireless earbuds with biosensing electrodes embedded inside the ear canal. These earbuds, sold as wellness products, read brain activity continuously. Non-invasive devices give lower resolution signals and carry far less medical risk. They are also vastly more widespread. The book argues, and I think correctly, that most of the consumer-facing concern in the next decade lives here. In the middle of the spectrum sit partially invasive devices. These sit beneath the skin or beneath the skull, but they do not penetrate brain tissue. Subdural electrode arrays. Endovascular stents threaded through the blood vessels. The Synchron device is a real example, with patients using it today. Partially invasive devices give a much cleaner signal without open brain surgery. Legally and medically, this is a frontier zone. And at the most invasive end, you have surgical implantation of electrodes directly into brain tissue. Deep brain stimulation for movement disorders is decades old. Newer high-density implants, the Utah Array, Neuralink, Paradromics, push the channel count into the thousands. Fully invasive systems offer the greatest precision and the greatest power. They also carry the greatest peril. Implant surgery is not reversible at the level of risk. The book quotes the United Nations Special Rapporteur on this point. Most wearables are marketed for concentration, sleep, or sport, yet their effectiveness is not scientifically backed, and their long-term effects are unknown. Keep that quote in mind. We will return to it when we get to consumer wellness regulation. Chapter 5 of the book identifies 6 specific properties that make neurotechnology, as a class, socially disruptive in a way other digital technologies have not been. The list comes from the United Nations Human Rights Council Report A/HRC/57/61, published in 2024. Let me read them carefully, because they are the foundation of everything that follows. Property 1. It exposes cognitive processes that were previously private. Things you have never told anyone, your fleeting reactions, your private associations, the words you almost said, become observable. Property 2. It can directly alter mental processes and thoughts. Not through persuasion or argument. Through physical intervention in the neural substrate that produces those processes. Property 3. It can bypass the conscious control or awareness of the user. The intervention can happen without you noticing. You don't know it's happening because the thing it changes is the apparatus that would notice. Property 4. It enables non-consensual external access to thoughts and emotions. Once a decoder exists and the signal can be captured remotely, classical consent becomes a different kind of question. Property 5. It generates neurodata, a new, uniquely sensitive personal data class. Neurodata is not like browsing history. It is not like DNA. It is something else, with its own properties, and existing data law was not written with it in mind. And Property 6. It processes large-scale, highly intimate datasets continuously. Continuously is the operative word. Once you put on a worn device, it runs. 6 properties. None of them, taken individually, would be entirely new. Taken together, they describe a categorically new situation. And it is on that basis that the book argues neurotechnology requires its own rights framework, not just a stretched version of the privacy law we already have. So why now? Why is this a conversation in the 2020s and not in the 1990s or in the 2050s? Chapter 7 of the book gives 3 reasons. First, capital. Private investment in neurotechnology has gone from roughly $331 million a year, a decade ago, to $7.3 billion cumulatively over the last 10 years. That is, roughly, a 22-fold growth in a decade. Second, state engagement. At least 8 major countries now run national brain initiatives: the United States, the European Union, China, Japan, South Korea, Israel, Australia, and others. Each is investing public money. Each is creating dual-use research pipelines. Third, and this is the one that should make you pay attention, there is, as of today, zero binding global treaty governing neurotechnology. There are soft norms. There is a UNESCO recommendation. There is a UN report. There is a Chilean constitutional amendment. But there is no enforceable, multilateral, treaty-level floor. The result is a gap. The deployment curve runs ahead of the legal curve. Foundation models for neural decoding are arriving simultaneously with mature consumer BCIs and with AI-driven inference from low-resolution signals. Regulation built for medical devices does not cover the wellness wearables that read the same brain. The window in which law can precede mass deployment is closing. That is the urgency the book is responding to. That is why this lecture exists. And that is why now. Part 2. The International Legal Landscape. We are now going to look at the law as it actually exists in 2026. Not the law as it should be, we will come to that. The law as it is. The picture is genuinely patchwork. There is a constitutional amendment in Chile. There is a UN Human Rights Council resolution. There is a UNESCO recommendation. There is a state-level statute in Colorado. There are partial cover provisions in the European Union AI Act. There is sectoral cover in the European GDPR. What there is not, anywhere in the world, is a comprehensive, binding, internationally enforceable neurorights floor. This part of the book is essentially a survey. We will move through it briskly. But it is worth knowing the landmarks, because every advocacy strategy you might pursue starts from the question, what already exists, and what is the next plausible move from here? The book builds its argument around 5 core neurorights, plus one prior question that contains them all. These 5 rights are not the author's invention. They draw on work by Marcelo Ienca, Rafael Yusti, and others in what is now an established international literature. But the book brings them together into one operational framework. Memorize these. They will come back, again and again. Right 1. Cognitive liberty. The freedom to control one's own consciousness, to think, to refuse to think, or to alter mental states without coercion from outside. This is the broadest of the 5. It is the right that the other 4 are, in some sense, instantiations of. Cognitive liberty is what is being protected when we talk about the freedom of thought as an absolute right under Article 18 of the ICCPR. Right 2. Mental privacy. Protection of neural data and the inferences drawn from it. The internal forum of the mind kept inviolable. Note carefully, the right is over the inferences as well as the data. A regulator who treats raw EEG as sensitive but treats inferences derived from it as ordinary derived data has misunderstood the right. The whole point is that inferences are the threat. Right 3. Mental integrity. Freedom from unauthorized alteration of brain activity. A guarantee against external neuromanipulation. Mental integrity is the right at stake when we talk about subliminal influence, about non-consensual neuromodulation, about hijacked attention. It is the structural protection of the apparatus that produces your thoughts, before we even get to the content of any specific thought. Right 4. Psychological continuity. The right to a stable sense of self over time, free from technological disruption of identity or memory. Psychological continuity is the right whose violation is hardest to detect, because the apparatus that would notice the disruption is, itself, what has been disrupted. And right 5. Fair access to enhancement. Equitable access to beneficial neurotechnology, to guard against a neurally divided society. This is the social justice dimension of the framework. Without it, neurorights would protect only those who could afford to opt in. Cognitive liberty. Mental privacy. Mental integrity. Psychological continuity. Fair access. 5 rights. One umbrella question, who owns your mind? That is the working framework for the rest of the book. Hold them in mind. They are the lenses we will use to see everything else. And one note. There is something seductive about having 5 neat categories. The world rarely respects neat categories. Most real cases will engage 2 or 3 rights at once. The framework is a tool for analysis, not a substitute for it. Now let's lay out the global landmarks, in chronological order. 2021. Chile becomes the first country in the world to amend its constitution specifically to protect mental integrity and brain data. This is not a sectoral law. It is a constitutional provision. 2022. The United Nations Human Rights Council passes Resolution 51/3, formally recognizing neurotechnology's human rights implications. A soft instrument, but it sets the diplomatic floor. 2024. The Human Rights Council follows with a comprehensive report, AHRC 57-61, the document I cited a few minutes ago. It is the most thorough international analysis to date. 2024, again. The U.S. state of Colorado, in House Bill 24-1058, becomes the first American jurisdiction to add neural data explicitly to its consumer privacy statute. 2024. The European Union AI Act enters into force. It bans subliminal manipulation and provides partial cover for high-risk neurotechnology applications. Partial cover, not comprehensive cover. 2025. UNESCO adopts its recommendation on the ethics of neurotechnology, the first global ethical framework, agreed by member states. Again, a recommendation, not a treaty. These protections are real. And they are uneven. Chapter 18bis of the book gives a complete catalogue, from supranational treaty drafts down to municipal rules. It is the single best reference for advocates. If you take only one chapter away as a working tool, take that one. Chapter 18 lays the leading approaches side by side. 3 contrasting models. Model 1. Chile and the Latin American template. Constitutional, rights first. Mexico, Brazil, and Spain have been weighing similar moves. Strong on principle, often vague on enforcement, and often quiet on consumer wellness devices that sit outside the medical perimeter. But this is the region where law most clearly precedes deployment. That is rare in the history of technology regulation. The Chilean constitutional amendment, in particular, is short and clean. It establishes mental integrity as a constitutionally protected right and places neural data under explicit protection. As constitutional drafting, it is admirably economical. As an enforcement regime, it has been a starting point rather than a finished work. The implementing legislation has been slower to arrive than the constitutional provision. Model 2. The European Union AI Act plus GDPR. Risk-tiered regulation. Hard prohibitions on subliminal manipulation. GDPR provides cover for neurodata, especially since neurodata almost always falls into the special category personal data tier. Gaps remain. Consumer EEG wellness devices in the wellness rather than medical channel. Military exemptions in the AI Act. The foundation model decoder layer that sits behind everything else. But this is the most mature legal apparatus in the world. Mature and still patchy. Worth noting, the EU's regulatory architecture has the property that its extraterritorial reach is unusually strong. Any company providing services to EU citizens has to comply with EU rules regardless of where the company is based. This is one of the few mechanisms by which a regional regulator can shape global practice. The book argues that EU action on neurotechnology will, in practice, set the global default whether the rest of the world participates or not. Model 3. The United States. Sectoral and state-led. Colorado in 2024. California followed in 2025. Other states are moving. There is no federal floor. The FDA covers medical devices only, so the wellness wearable is again outside the perimeter. The United States is, in effect, a laboratory of states and a laboratory of gaps. The American pattern is familiar from earlier technology debates. State-level innovation in the absence of federal action. This produces useful experimentation. It also produces regulatory arbitrage. A consumer device legal in Texas may not be legal in Colorado. A neurodata processing pipeline legal in Florida may not be legal in California. The patchwork is real. It is also, paradoxically, the source of the most legal energy in American neurorights work today. And there are 2 further frames the book treats separately. Chapter 13 discusses authoritarian uses, places where the central question is not consent but coercion. And Chapter 14 takes the Global South perspective, where the central question is not just regulation but capacity building. Authoritarian uses present a different problem. Where the law is the instrument of the state's interest in surveillance, neurorights frameworks designed for liberal democracies have limited purchase. International instruments matter more in this context, but international instruments require enforcement mechanisms that, today, do not exist for neurotechnology. The Global South perspective is similarly distinct. Many jurisdictions face the challenge not of restraining existing capability, but of building the technical and regulatory capacity to engage with capability that will arrive whether they are ready or not. Capacity building is a different policy task than restraint. The book is clear that both must happen. The legal landscape is not one landscape. It is several, layered on top of each other. Part 3. The sovereignty of thought. If Parts 1 and 2 told us what the technology is and where the law currently sits, Part 3 asks the deeper question, what is it we are actually trying to protect? And the answer the book gives is striking. We are trying to protect what philosophers and lawyers have called the forum internum, the inner forum of thought, conscience, and belief. We will look at the doctrine that protects it, from Locke through Mill through European Court of Human Rights jurisprudence. We will look at what mental privacy means in the age of brain reading. And we will look at two harder problems, discrimination on the basis of neural data, and the strange question of whether anyone can own a thought as intellectual property. Of all the parts of the book, this one is the most philosophically demanding. Let's take it seriously. Why are your thoughts sacred? Not as a metaphor, as a matter of international law. Since the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948, the international system has recognized one zone of human life as absolute. Not relative. Not balanced against state interests. Absolute. That zone is the forum internum, the inner forum of thought, conscience, and belief. It is non-derogable. That word has technical force. Non-derogable means that even in war, even in national emergency, even under terrorist threat, the state cannot suspend the right. Article 18 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights codifies it. Article 9 of the European Convention on Human Rights codifies it. The jurisprudence behind it traces back through John Stuart Mill, through John Locke, through the entire liberal tradition. Locke, writing in 1689 in his letter concerning toleration, made the point in its starkest form: the magistrate's authority extends to outward acts, not to inward belief. The reason was practical as much as philosophical. The magistrate had no apparatus that could reach inward belief, so claiming jurisdiction over it would have been pointless. Mill, in On Liberty, 2 centuries later, extended the argument from religious belief to opinion in general, and framed it as essential to the discovery of truth as well as to individual dignity. And the European Court of Human Rights, in case after case, has reaffirmed that the forum internum is the one zone the state may not enter, even when it could be useful to do so. Why so absolute? Because if the inner forum is not protected, every other right collapses. Freedom of religion presupposes the freedom to believe. Freedom of speech presupposes the freedom to think the speech first. Freedom from torture presupposes that there is an inner you that the state cannot reach. If you can reach the inner you, the entire architecture of rights becomes the regulation of the means by which that inner reach is conducted, rather than the absolute prohibition of the reach itself. The book argues we should not let the architecture slide in that direction. Quote, the one frontier on which the law has, historically, never compromised, the freedom to think, believe, and form opinions in one's own mind. End quote. Neurotechnology is the first technology in human history capable of crossing that frontier from the outside. If the technology can decode and modulate the contents of that zone, the absolute prohibition does not retreat. It needs a new operational meaning. Building that operational meaning is much of what this book is trying to do. And the framing matters. Some commentators have argued that the forum internum doctrine is obsolete because the technology has changed. The book takes the opposite view. The doctrine is not obsolete. It is now operationally necessary. The fact that we now have the means to violate it is exactly the reason it has to be defended, not abandoned. Chapter 21 focuses specifically on mental privacy in the age of brain reading. And here the book makes a point that is often missed in popular coverage. The threat is not just direct readout. The threat is inference. Let me say that again, because it matters. The threat is not just direct readout. The threat is inference. Even crude electroencephalographic signals, the kind you can capture from a consumer headband, when run through foundation model decoders trained on millions of brain state pairs, can be used to infer emotion, attention, deception, even political affinity, without ever reading a thought in the literal sense. If you have ever wondered why this is a problem that even cheap, low-resolution hardware can cause, that is the answer. The model does the heavy lifting. Second point, neurodata is a new data class. It is personal. It is persistent. It is partially involuntary, you cannot easily refuse to generate it while you wear the device. And it is richer than browsing history. It is richer, in some ways, than DNA. Existing data protection frameworks were not designed with neurodata in mind. Third point, there is no turning it off in the same way you can turn off a phone. Unlike a phone you can put down, a worn or implanted neurotechnology device runs continuously while you wear it. Consent at sign-up cannot mean consent forever. The book argues for a principle of time-limited, purpose-bound use. Each session of use is its own consent event. We will see this principle again in the legislative agenda. It is one of the operational handles the book gives us. 2 harder problems. Chapters 22 and 23. Problem 1, Neurodiscrimination. When brain-derived inferences feed hiring decisions, insurance pricing, lending, school placement, criminal risk scoring, ordinary anti-discrimination law has nothing labeled neural status to grab onto. We have categories like race, sex, age, disability. We do not have a category called neural status, or attention profile, or emotional reactivity signature. The book proposes that neural status be added as a protected characteristic. That is a non-trivial legal proposal, and it requires answering questions that have not yet been answered. How do you prove discrimination on the basis of inferred neural traits? Where is the comparator? What is the remedy? Anti-discrimination law usually compares like with like. Neurodata reveals dimensions on which no one has yet been compared. New categories will need new doctrine. Problem 2, Intellectual property over brain data. Can a company own your neural data the way it currently owns your search history? Under most end-user license agreements today, yes. By signing up, you assign certain rights in the data you generate. The book argues this is mistaken. Neurodata is not merely personal data. It is constitutive of personhood, it cannot meaningfully be alienated like a click stream. If your inner monologue is property, and the property can be sold, then you can be sold. The book takes that argument to its conclusion. These are open legal problems. Chapters 22 and 23 set them out. They do not pretend to have closed them. Part 4. Neurotechnology in warfare. We are now going to spend some time in uncomfortable territory. Cognitive warfare. Neuroweapons. Programs run by DARPA, by NATO, by China, by Russia. The question of where the front line of the mind now sits. I want to flag, before we start, this is a part of the book where the author is careful to distinguish documented capability from speculation. Not everything in this section is established. Some of it is reported and acknowledged program detail. Some of it is the subject of ongoing intelligence community assessment. And some of it, frankly, is contested. The book holds those categories apart, and we will too. But what is not contested is that several states have formalized cognition as a military domain. NATO calls it the 6th operational domain. The doctrine exists. The investment exists. The era in which we could pretend the mind was off the strategic map has ended. Cognitive warfare is not new. Chapter 24 gives a short history. First World War, Second World War. Mass propaganda. Radio and cinema turn the population into a target. Information operations become a state capability. We have been here, in some form, for 100 years. It is worth remembering that the language of propaganda, the word itself, derived from the Catholic Congregatio de Propaganda Fide of 1622, long predates the technology. The capacity to influence a population is old. The technology that scaled it changed in the 20th century. Cold War. MKUltra on the American side. Soviet psychotronics on the other. Behavioral conditioning, LSD experimentation, sensory deprivation. Much of it scientifically ineffective. almost all of it deeply unethical by any modern standard. Senate investigated in the United States in the 1970s. Records partially destroyed. We will come back to that in some detail when we reach part 15. But the structural point is worth flagging now. Cold War neuroinfluence research was, by today's standards, scientifically crude. It also produced harm. And it laid down the institutional habits, secrecy, civil liberties violations, weak oversight, that have shaped how the topic has been handled ever since. 2010s. Social media manipulation. Cambridge Analytica. Troll farms. Micro-targeted political advertising. Influence engineered at population scale, using behavioral data, not neural data. Note the distinction. Cambridge Analytica used Facebook likes and inferred psychological profiles. It did not, by any public account, use brain signals. It worked, to the extent it worked, by inferring from behavioral data. The book argues that the next iteration, neurodata-informed targeting, will work by inferring from neural data directly. 2020s. NATO names cognition the sixth operational domain, alongside land, sea, air, space, and cyber. Cognitive warfare is now a formal pillar of Allied military doctrine. This is not a metaphorical move. Domain recognition has budgetary consequences. It has training doctrine consequences. It has procurement consequences. When NATO declares a domain, hardware and software start to be built specifically for that domain. The declaration of cognition as a domain therefore reorganizes a substantial part of military research. And from there to now. Neuro-enabled operations. Decoders. Neuromodulators. Radio frequency-based effects. BCI-paired drones. Capability moving, slowly but visibly, from laboratory to field. The arc is from propaganda, influencing what you read, through micro-targeting, influencing what you see, to neuro-enabled operations, influencing the substrate that processes both. Each stage has been more direct than the last. We are now at the most direct stage we have ever been. And the direction of travel is, unmistakably, toward more direct intervention. Not less. The book's argument is that the time to set the rules is before the next stage opens, not after. Chapters 27 through 30 profile 4 state programs. The United States. DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, runs the N3 program, which targets non-surgical neurotechnology for healthy operators. The goal is high bandwidth, non-implanted brain-computer interfacing for soldiers in the field. DARPA work is heavily coupled with private industry. The technology developed under defense grants routinely fields a civilian variant. Russia. Decades of state-level research into remote influence and behavioral conditioning, going back to the Soviet psychotronics programs. Much of it remains classified. Some declassified material exists, and the book references the academic literature on it. Assessing current Russian capability is genuinely difficult, and the book is restrained on this point. China. Military brain science. The civil-military fusion strategy formally adopted by Beijing explicitly includes neurotechnology. State industrial policy aligns commercial and defense research in a way that makes the boundary almost meaningless. A Chinese consumer EEG firm and a Chinese military neural research program often share staff, share laboratories, share intellectual property. NATO. Cognitive domain doctrine. The North Atlantic Alliance has formally recognized cognition as the sixth operational domain. This is doctrine. It is more than capability. It changes how planning works, how training works, how budgeting works. 4 traditions. 4 different relationships between the state and the brain. And no current arms control framework that treats them all together. Chapters 26 and 31 inventory what exists and what is plausibly being developed. Let me start with the most contested example, Havana syndrome. In 2016, U.S. diplomats and intelligence officers in Havana began reporting acute neurological symptoms, headaches, dizziness, cognitive impairment, hearing pressure-like sounds, with no obvious environmental cause. Similar reports followed from Guangzhou, from Vienna, and from other diplomatic posts. Was it a directed energy attack? The United States National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine examined the question. A 2023 Office of the Director of National Intelligence Assessment reached a different conclusion. The case is not closed. The book treats Havana syndrome not as a settled case but as the moment when the policy community began to take seriously the possibility of remote, directed neuro effects. Whether or not Havana itself was such an attack, it changed the conversation. From there, here are the broad categories the book describes. 1. Directed energy effects. Radiofrequency, ultrasonic, or optical methods aimed at neural tissue. 2. Targeted modulation. Wearable or remotely applied transcranial magnetic stimulation or transcranial focused ultrasound, used against adversary operators. 3. Cognitive psychological operations. AI-driven, neurodata-informed influence at scale, what cognitive warfare looks like in its most modern form. 4. BCI-paired weapons. Direct neural command of drones, vehicles, optical systems. Less mature, but actively pursued. And 5. Memory and belief shaping. Stimulation protocols influencing recall or emotional valence. Most demonstrated only in laboratory conditions. Most very specific in scope. But the path from laboratory to field is the path the book takes seriously. Chapter 33 BIS offers a framework for thinking about where mind control risk actually comes from. It is a useful framework because it disciplines the conversation. Most public discussion of these threats moves quickly from vague worry to vague claim. The framework forces specificity. 3 columns. Vectors. Actors. Consequences. Let's work through each. Vectors are the routes by which influence can reach a brain. Directed radiofrequency or ultrasound. The Fry effect for microwaves is documented. Focused ultrasound stimulation is in research. The vectors exist in principle. Their effective range and the difficulty of targeting in real-world conditions are open questions. Pharmacological or chemical agents. The oldest vector, with the deepest historical record. From culture to current research, chemical means of altering cognition are well understood. The book is careful to note that this vector overlaps with non-malicious medical practice, which complicates regulatory responses. Worn or implanted neuromodulators. If the user wears a device that can stimulate the brain, the device is potentially a vector. The vendor's intent matters legally, but the technical capability is built in. Coercive media combined with AI personalized influence, the soft vector, but the most widespread. The dominant vector today, by far. Most actual harm from cognitive influence at the population level comes through this channel. The other vectors are more dramatic. This one is more pervasive. And compromised consumer devices, a hijacked earbud, a malware-infected headband. As consumer neurotechnology proliferates, the attack surface for compromise grows. 5 vectors. The signal can arrive in 5 different ways. Actors are the people who would do it. State military and intelligence services. Private security contractors. Organized crime. Corporations, commercially incentivized manipulation that does not require state involvement at all. And, increasingly with the falling cost of the technology, lone, technically capable individuals. 5 actor categories. Each has motive. Each has potential means. Notice that the actor categories overlap with the vectors in different ways. State actors have all 5 vectors available. Corporations primarily use the soft vector. Lone individuals usually have the compromised device or pharmacological vector. The threat model differs by actor. The defense has to differ accordingly. Consequences are what happens when an attack succeeds. Symptoms with no clear cause. Behavioral drift, decisions not felt as the agent's own. Identity disturbance. Loss of trust in one's own perception. And the cruelest failure mode, diagnostic failure, in which the victim is given a psychiatric label that closes off further investigation. That last point matters enormously for the next section. The reason detection is so hard is that the consequences of a real attack and the symptoms of common psychiatric conditions can be the same. We will spend the next part of the book on exactly that problem. And one more note before we move on. The framework is not predictive. It does not tell us that any specific attack is happening. What it tells us is what an attack would look like, structurally, if it did. The framework is a tool for clinical, forensic, and regulatory work. Used well, it makes investigation possible. Used badly, it makes paranoia more articulate. The discipline is in the application. Part 5. The targeted individual phenomenon. This is the most contested part of the book, and the part the author is most careful with. Targeted individuals, TIs, in the shorthand of the community, are people who report being subjected to non-consensual technological targeting. Sustained surveillance. Harassment. What they describe as remote forms of physical and psychological influence. The phenomenon spans countries, spans languages, spans educational backgrounds. The testimony is too consistent in its patterns to dismiss entirely. And it is too contested in its causal claims to accept at face value. How the book handles it, neither credulous nor dismissive, is in many ways the test of the whole framework. If we cannot find a way to take this body of testimony seriously without either accepting every claim or rejecting every claim, then our Neurorights apparatus is not yet adequate. Chapter 34 introduces the phenomenon. A growing number of individuals worldwide, the estimates are imprecise but the order of magnitude is at least the tens of thousands, report being subjected to non-consensual technological targeting. The reports come from countries on every continent. They come in many languages. They come from people of many educational and professional backgrounds. It is not a uniform set of claims. Different individuals report different specific experiences and attribute them to different agents. Not all of it can be true in the same way. The book's stance is explicit. Neither credulous nor dismissive. Take the testimony seriously as a body of human accounts that current institutions have failed to handle adequately. Hold critical distance from any single causal theory. And treat the failure of recognition as itself a problem worth documenting, regardless of how individual cases ultimately resolve. Why does this matter for the larger argument? Because the targeted individual phenomenon is the strongest pressure test of every Neurorights framework we are going to discuss. If our law cannot tell the difference between genuine technological abuse and mistaken attribution, and cannot route either to the appropriate response, then the rights we are talking about are paper only. Whatever else we do today, we cannot wave this part of the book away. Chapters 35 and 36 catalog the patterns that recur across TI testimony. These are not the author's claims about what is happening. They are descriptions of what is consistently reported. I want to underline that distinction carefully. The patterns are the data. What causes them is the open question. Pattern 1. Acoustic phenomena. Voice-to-skull experiences, internal speech that does not feel like one's own thought. Persistent tinnitus-like sounds. Unattributable internal speech in voices other than the person's own. Voice-to-skull is a term that has a specific technical history. The microwave auditory effect, first documented by Alan Fry in 1962, showed that pulsed microwave radiation can induce auditory sensations in human subjects. That is a peer-reviewed, replicated finding. Whether modern reports of voice-to-skull experience are caused by that mechanism, by other technological mechanisms, or by clinical phenomena, is what the differential diagnosis problem is about. Pattern 2. Somatic effects. Sensations of burning, vibration, focal pain. Sleep disruption that the individual experiences as externally caused, often described as following a directional source. The directionality is a recurring feature of testimony. Multiple individuals, in independent reports, describe symptoms that worsen when facing one direction and lessen when facing another. That pattern is consistent with directed energy effects. It is also consistent with confirmation bias once a theory is in place. The pattern itself does not adjudicate the question. Pattern 3. Surveillance sense. A consistent feeling of being monitored, often supported by concrete coincidences the individual cites as evidence, vehicles following, unexplained interference with devices, predictive responses from strangers. Pattern 4. Cognitive disruption. Intrusive thoughts. Attention sabotage, the inability to maintain concentration in characteristic ways. Sudden mood shifts perceived as externally caused. Pattern 5. social isolation, loss of work, of family, of personal credibility. The book makes a point that is easy to miss. Much of the harm reported by targeted individuals comes not from any technology but from the consequence of not being believed. Friends withdraw. Family members worry but cannot help. Employers find the symptoms incompatible with workplace demands. The medical system labels and medicates. By the time the person reaches out for advocacy, they have often already lost the social infrastructure that would have helped them, regardless of the cause. Pattern 6. Psychological toll. Anxiety, depression, suicidal ideation. These are real outcomes regardless of how the underlying causation is ultimately decided. Suicide rates within the self-identified targeted individual community appear, from advocacy organization reports, to be elevated relative to baseline. This is a public health concern in itself. These 6 patterns are documented by the book simply as the patterns that occur. Whether and to what extent each individual case has a technological cause is a separate question. What the patterns show is that, at minimum, current institutions are failing many people. And the book's view is that failing them is not the only available response. We can build institutions that engage these accounts with seriousness, with clinical rigor, and with the legal infrastructure to investigate when investigation is warranted. That is not credulity. It is institutional design. Chapter 37 is the book's most careful chapter, and it deserves slow attention. The problem is differential diagnosis. The same set of symptoms can arise from psychiatric illness, from genuine technological targeting, or from a mixture of the two. Diagnosing one as the other has real costs, in both directions. Consider the cost of misdiagnosing genuine technological abuse as psychiatric illness. First, genuine victims are left without protection or recourse. Second, the technological abuse goes uninvestigated, uncorrected, and therefore likely repeated. Third, antipsychotic medication given to a non-psychotic person causes iatrogenic harm, harm caused by the treatment itself. Antipsychotics, even when well tolerated, have meaningful side effects, weight gain, metabolic changes, motor side effects, sometimes irreversible. Giving them to a person who does not need them is a serious harm in itself, regardless of the original cause of their complaint. And fourth, this pattern, repeated, erodes trust in medical and legal institutions across the whole community. Now consider the cost in the opposite direction, misdiagnosing genuine mental illness as technological abuse. First, the mental illness is left untreated. Untreated psychosis can be lethal. The lifetime suicide rate in untreated schizophrenia is around 5 to 10%. This is not a small consideration. It is a major one. Second, investigative resources are misallocated to investigations that will not resolve. Third, belief structures that worsen prognosis are reinforced. A person becomes more deeply embedded in an attribution framework that, if it is mistaken, makes recovery harder. And fourth, the credibility of the broader community of people reporting genuine abuse is damaged by association. Both errors are serious. Both have human costs. The book argues that current systems make the first error, misdiagnosing technological abuse as psychiatric illness, the default. And that any responsible framework has to build the capacity to make this distinction better. Notice that the book is not arguing that all targeted individual reports describe genuine technological attacks. It is arguing that institutions should be able to tell the difference, and currently mostly cannot. Building that capacity is itself a research project. It is a clinical training project. It is an institutional design project. It is not solved by either credulity or by dismissal. We will come back to what such a framework looks like in Part 6. The point I want to leave you with here is this. The cost of getting this wrong, in either direction, falls on individuals. It does not fall on the abstractions debated in journals. It falls on the person sitting in the clinic, the person sitting in the courtroom, the person sitting alone at home. Designing the system to fail less is therefore not optional. Part 6. Detection, Forensics, and Response. A ban without a detector is decoration. That is the operating principle of this part. It is one thing to declare that neuroweapons are prohibited. It is another thing entirely to detect their use, to attribute it, to bring evidence to a courtroom or to a treaty body, and to make the prohibition real. Part 6 lays out the forensic machinery the book argues we will need. It also defines the criteria by which a person can be recognized as a victim of neurotechnology, criteria that have legal consequences and that have to be defended on their merits. Chapters 38 and 39 make the case for a global ban on neuroweapons. The argument places certain applications of neurotechnology on the same shelf as chemical and biological weapons, prohibited by treaty, with no military utility exception. Now, treaty prohibition of a weapons class is, historically, a high bar. It requires that the weapons class be perceived as either uniquely cruel, or as inherently uncontrollable in its effects, or as so destabilizing that it should be outside the rules of legitimate combat altogether. Chemical weapons cleared that bar in 1925, then again in 1993. Biological weapons cleared it in 1972. Anti-personnel land mines cleared it in 1997. Cluster munitions cleared it in 2008. The book argues that certain neuroweapon categories meet the same threshold. The argument runs on 4 objections. Objection 1. The category objection. Like chemical and biological weapons, neuroweapons target the irreducible person, not the combatant function. There is an asymmetry from the victim's side. The injury is to the substrate of selfhood. A bullet wound is an injury to the body. A neuroattack is an injury to the apparatus that experiences the injury, that processes it, that decides how to respond to it. It is, in that sense, an injury to a different kind of object. Objection 2. The non-discrimination objection. In international humanitarian law, distinction between combatants and civilians is foundational. Neuroweapons spill beyond targets, into bystanders, into families, into shared public spaces. A directed energy effect cannot, in most realistic deployments, perfectly confine its effects to a single human nervous system in a crowd. The distinction principle becomes impossible to honor in practice. Objection 3. The dignity objection. Hijacking cognition is not a normal injury. It overrides the will that makes responsibility, moral, legal, theological, possible at all. A person whose cognition has been externally hijacked is not less of a combatant. They have, for the duration of the attack, ceased to be an agent. Every legal system in the world recognizes some form of the principle that you are not responsible for acts you did not will. Neuroweapons attack that principle directly. They produce acts that the victim cannot meaningfully be said to have willed. Objection 4. The escalation objection. Some categories of neuroweapon are cheap, deniable, and hard to attribute. Those properties together, cheap, deniable, hard to attribute, are exactly the properties that lower the threshold to coercion. And the lower the threshold to coercion, the more deterrence corrodes. States and non-state actors that would not consider conventional kinetic action will consider unattributable cognitive action. 4 objections. The book argues that, together, they meet the threshold for treaty prohibition. An honest counterargument has to engage all 4. Most counterarguments engage only one, usually the second, about distinction, which is the most contestable on technical grounds. The first, third, and fourth are not technical objections. They are structural ones. And the book's claim is that they are dispositive. Detection, making the ban real. Chapters 40 and 41. Without detection, prohibition is a slogan. The book proposes 4 pillars of detection infrastructure. Pillar 1. Radio frequency and acoustic environment monitoring. Persistent, anonymized sensing in sensitive sites, embassies, parliaments, hospitals, sensitive military facilities. The goal is anomaly detection, not content interception. You are not listening to what people are saying. You are watching for the energy signature that should not be there. Pillar 2. Biomarkers and clinical protocols. Imaging protocols, audiology protocols, neurological examination protocols specific to suspected neuroattack. Borrowed from, but distinct from, psychiatric workups. A person who is examined by a clinician who does not know what to look for is a person whose evidence is not collected even if it exists. Pillar 3. Chain of custody for neurodata. Evidence-grade handling of brain data, with provenance, timestamping, reproducible analysis, so that, when the matter reaches a courtroom, the data can survive cross-examination. Pillar 4. Whistleblower channels into industry. Most early detection of misuse is going to come from inside the companies and laboratories that build the technology. Whistleblower protection, which we will discuss in Part 13, is not a separate civic concern. It is detection infrastructure. 4 pillars. The book argues that none of these is technically impossible. What is missing is the institutional will to build them. Chapter 42 takes on a definitional problem that has serious legal consequences. What counts as a victim of neurotechnology? The book proposes 3 tiers. Each has different evidentiary requirements and different downstream entitlements. Tier 1. Confirmed. There is forensic or instrumental evidence of an unauthorized neuro effect. This is the narrowest set. With current technology, it is the hardest set to populate. But it is the set whose cases the law can most easily process. Tier 2. Probable. Pattern-consistent symptoms. Plausible exposure. No better explanation available. This will be the largest investigable set. Most cases that resolve will resolve here. Tier 3. Self-reported. Testimony without instrumental confirmation. This tier cannot be dismissed, testimony is evidence. It also cannot be treated as established. The book argues for routing self-reported cases to care plus investigation. Both, not either. The recognition tier determines what the legal system owes the person, investigation, care, compensation, or all 3. Defining the tiers is itself a political act. And it is a political act the book argues we have to perform deliberately, not by default. Part 7. The ethics of neurotechnology. Now we move from forensics to ethics. 3 threads. First, torture. The absolute prohibition on torture in international law, and what it means for non-consensual neurouse. Second, medical exceptions. When, if ever, is non-consensual neuromodification ethically justified? And third, the slippery slope. The path from medical consent to civic coercion. Part 7 is the part of the book most directly in conversation with bioethics as an existing discipline. If you come to this lecture for medicine, this is the section where the conversation gets most concrete. Chapter 43, The Absolute Prohibition. The Convention Against Torture. International law binds states unconditionally on torture. There is no derogation in war. There is no derogation in public emergency. There is no derogation under threat of terrorism. The Convention Against Torture is, in this respect, almost unique. It is one of a very small number of treaty obligations from which states cannot lawfully release themselves under any circumstances. The book makes a specific claim. Any non-consensual neuromodification used for interrogation, for punishment, for intimidation, or for discrimination meets the convention definition by design. Not by analogy. By design. Let's unpack what that means. The Convention Against Torture, in Article 1, defines torture as the intentional infliction of severe pain or suffering, physical or mental, by or with the consent of a public official, for one of 4 purposes. Those 4 purposes are obtaining information or a confession, punishment, intimidation or coercion, or discrimination of any kind. Notice that mental suffering is explicit. Notice that the 4 purposes are framed broadly. Let me read the book's paraphrased formulation. Quote, if neurotechnology can be used to inflict severe mental suffering, or to extract information directly from the brain without consent, then its use against a person in custody is torture, not an enhanced interrogation technique, not a gray area, not cruel but lawful. End quote. Notice how this argument works. It does not depend on proving that neurointerrogation is, in some empirical sense, worse than physical torture. It depends on the structural definition. Severe suffering. Inflicted by a public official. For one of the prohibited purposes. The convention's elements are met. The prohibition follows. If this argument is correct, it has implications well beyond the obvious cases. Coercive neuromodulation in a prison setting, used to manage difficult prisoners, torture. Forced administration of mood-altering treatment as punishment, torture. Compulsory cognitive testing as a condition of release that the prisoner cannot meaningfully refuse, under the right facts, torture. Each of these, on the book's reading, falls under the convention. We do not need a new doctrine to reach them. We need only to take the existing doctrine seriously. And there is a corollary that is worth noting. The convention obliges states not only to refrain from torture themselves but also to prevent it within their jurisdiction. That positive obligation, applied to neurotechnology, means that states have to put in place the inspection and oversight regimes that would actually prevent the prohibited uses. The prohibition is not just abstinence. It is institutional. Building the institutions is part of meeting the treaty obligation. 3 Hard Ethical Edges. Chapters 44 through 46. Edge 1. Medical exceptions. When is non-consensual use ethically justified? The book takes seriously the cases where the question is genuinely open. Acute psychiatric emergency, where a person in crisis cannot meaningfully consent or refuse. Locked-in syndrome, where the only way to restore the very capacity to consent is to intervene first. The book's bar is high. Explicit advance directive frameworks. The narrowest possible scope. Mandatory review by an independent body. Medical exceptions are real. They are also the thin end of the wedge if not constrained. Edge 2. Brain reading as evidence. Chapter 45. Functional imaging in court. fMRI-based lie detection. Neural memory traces. The reliability of these methods remains contested in the scientific literature. The book argues against admissibility under the current state of the art, and for a structured reevaluation as the science matures. Not a permanent prohibition. A current prohibition under current uncertainty. Edge 3. The slippery slope. Chapter 46. From consent to coercion. Jobs that quote-unquote require a wearable. Schools that recommend one. Courts that invite one. Consent under structural pressure is not consent. If you cannot meaningfully say no without losing the job, losing the school place, losing the courtroom's goodwill, then your yes is not consent. It is compliance. Voluntariness has to be an enforceable legal standard. Not a checkbox at sign-up. The book is unambiguous on that point. Part 8. The Benevolent Future. It would be easy, given everything we have just discussed, to leave this lecture with the impression that the book is anti-technology. It is not. Part 8 is where the case for the benevolent uses gets made, fully and concretely. What neurotechnology can give us is enormous. Restored movement to people with paralysis. Effective treatment for depression that resists every other therapy. Hearing for the deaf. Communication for the locked-in. Learning tools that meet a child where they are. The argument of the book is not against neurotechnology. It is against deployment without rights. Those are very different positions. Let's see what the upside actually looks like. Chapters 47 and 48 catalog the medical miracles. Let me dwell on these, because the case for cautious neurotechnology is, at heart, a case for these patients. Parkinson's disease. Deep brain stimulation, DBS, has, for 2 decades, restored motor control to people whose movement disorder had progressed beyond pharmacological help. It does not cure the underlying disease. It transforms how it is lived. If you have ever seen a patient who can suddenly walk again after years of being trapped in a body that would not respond, you understand why this work has to continue. Treatment-resistant depression. Closed-loop stimulation, where the device adjusts its therapy in real time to the patient's mood state, is moving from research into clinical practice. For some patients, it works when nothing else has worked. Depression that has resisted years of medication and therapy can, in some cases, respond to a properly tuned stimulation protocol. The mortality implications are not trivial. Paralysis and locked-in syndrome. Brain-computer interfaces are restoring speech to people who have lost it. Restoring written communication. Restoring, in research settings, limb movement through robotic prosthetics or even through reanimation of the patient's own muscles. Recent research has demonstrated decoding of internal speech at rates approaching natural conversation for patients with severe paralysis. The clinical implication is enormous. Locked-in patients, who can think but cannot communicate, gain back the capacity to participate in their own lives. Epilepsy. Responsive neurostimulation, devices that detect a seizure forming and intervene before it generalizes, has cut seizure frequency by an order of magnitude in patients who respond to it. For a patient whose epilepsy has not responded to standard medication, this is the difference between a life shaped around seizures and a life that is not. Sensory restoration. Cochlear implants have given hearing to the deaf for decades. This is not new. More than 1 million cochlear implant recipients now exist worldwide. The technology has matured. The political controversies about deaf identity and community are real, but the technology itself has crossed every threshold of clinical normality. Visual prostheses are in trials. The trajectory toward restoring sight to forms of blindness is real, even if it is not yet routine. And mental health frontiers. Obsessive-compulsive disorder. Post-traumatic stress disorder. Anorexia. Deep brain stimulation protocols are in active investigation for each of these. These are not promises. They are existing, ongoing clinical realities. The book takes the view that to be against the deployment of medical neurotechnology, full stop, is to be against the relief of suffering it provides. What the book is for is the conditions under which deployment proceeds, the rights framework that should accompany it. There is no contradiction here. You can want the technology to reach the patients who need it, while also wanting the technology not to reach the deployments that would harm everyone. Differentiating the two cases is the work of rights-based regulation. It is not the work of either prohibition or laissez-faire. Beyond medicine, there is enhancement and there is education. Chapters 48 and 49. Cognitive enhancement. The slogan is smarter, faster, better. The claims include memory augmentation, focus modulation, working memory boost. Some of the claims are real. Many are overclaimed by an order of magnitude. The ethical question, the book argues, is not should enhancement be allowed. People will pursue it. The question is, if it is, on what terms, and at what price for those who decline. If your job market is full of people who have taken focus enhancement, what does that do to your situation if you have not? The harm is not just to the enhanced. It is to the unenhanced who now compete in a market structured by enhancement. That is why enhancement is a rights question and not merely a personal choice question. Neuroeducation. Chapter 49. Learning at the speed of thought. Adaptive educational systems that read a child's attention and modulate instruction in real time. Gains for some children. Pressure on all children, including the children whose parents decline. The book asks for opt-out as a default, not an exception. Whatever benefits adaptive neuroeducation brings, the institutional default should be that families can refuse without consequence. If they cannot, the educational system has, in effect, conscripted children into a monitoring system on the basis of their developmental need for school. Chapters 50 and 51. Mental Health Frontiers and the Centaur Model. Closed-loop psychiatry. Devices that detect a developing depressive or anxiety state and intervene before symptoms peak. This is promising. It is genuinely new. And it is contingent on neurodata governance that does not yet exist. If your device knows you are about to slip into depression before you do, and the device manufacturer also knows, what governance prevents that information from reaching your employer, your insurer, your school? The book argues that the medical case for closed-loop psychiatry is strong. The infrastructure case is missing. The Centaur Model. Chapter 51. Human-machine teaming. The metaphor comes from chess, where after the rise of machine play, the strongest competitors were human plus machine pairs, the centaur. Human judgment plus machine pattern matching. The book treats this as the most realistic productive use of BCI in most professions for the next decade. Not the autonomous augmented worker. The collaborator. The human in the loop, using neural signal not to surrender judgment but to extend it. And the broader point, if neurorights are robust, the upside is large. The book is not anti-technology. It is anti-deployment without rights. Those are very different positions and the distinction matters. Part 9. Artificial Intelligence and Neurotechnology. If Part 8 was the case for the benevolent future, Part 9 is the case for why getting this right is suddenly much more urgent. Foundation models, the same class of models that gave us large language models, changed neural decoding the same way they changed natural language processing. The implication is that the capability we are regulating in 2026 is not the capability we will be regulating in 2029. And the gap between the regulatory cycle and the capability cycle is going to widen, not narrow, unless we move now. Chapters 52 and 53 make what the book treats as a pivotal technical claim. AI is becoming the brain's operating system. Let me unpack what that means. Before foundation models, before the transformer architecture, before the large pre-trained generalist models, neural decoding worked like this. You wanted to decode imagined movement in patient A? You collected labeled data from patient A. You trained a bespoke model. You used it for that patient, for that task. If you then wanted to decode imagined speech in patient B, you started over. Different model. Different labeled data. Different calibration. After foundation models, the picture changes. Decoders are pre-trained on millions of brain state pairs across thousands of subjects and tasks. They generalize across users. They generalize across downstream applications. A few minutes of calibration replaces weeks of subject-specific training. Why does this matter legally? Because the decoder of 2027 can be a fine-tune of an off-the-shelf foundation model. The barriers to entry collapse. Containment by export control alone will not work. You cannot keep a model behind a national border if it can be downloaded over the internet. The lesson the book draws is that the regulatory strategy has to be use-based, not artifact-based. You cannot stop the model from existing. You can only govern what is done with it. That changes which legal tools you reach for. Chapter 54 addresses algorithmic bias in neurotechnology. Neural data is not neutral. Like every other dataset used to train an AI system, the training sets behind neural decoders overrepresent some populations and underrepresent others. Young. Healthy. Western. Often male. Often student volunteers at university medical centers, because that is where the recruiting is easy. The decoders that follow inherit that distribution. 6 forms of bias that follow. 1. Demographic bias. Lower accuracy for subjects underrepresented in training data, by race, sex, age, or medical status. The pattern from facial recognition research applies here too. Systems work well on the populations they were trained on. They fail more often on populations they were not. 2. Cultural and linguistic bias. Decoders trained on English language inner speech perform unevenly on multilingual minds. If you grew up between 2 languages, the decoder may not know what to do with the way your inner monologue actually works. And it is not just the languages. The cognitive habits, how memory is structured, how planning is rehearsed, how emotion is verbally labeled, vary culturally. The decoder absorbs the cultural assumptions of its training data and reproduces them. 3. Pathology bias. Models trained on neurotypical brains generalize poorly to patient populations, the very population the medical neurotechnology will be sold to. This is a perverse outcome. The training data is convenient, healthy university students. The market is the patient population. The decoder is, by construction, less accurate on the people it is supposed to help most. 4. Feedback loops. Biased decoders inform clinical diagnoses that produce more cases labeled in the biased direction. Those labels then re-enter the training data. The bias gets baked in. This is the dynamic that makes algorithmic bias different from ordinary measurement bias. It compounds over time, because the outputs of the system become the inputs to the next generation of the system. 5. Opacity. Even the authors of the model often cannot say which neural features it relies on. Contesting an output becomes very difficult, both clinically and legally. If a patient is told the system predicts a poor outcome and the clinician cannot say why, the patient has very little to grasp in disputing the prediction. Algorithmic medicine, deployed naively, is hard to argue with. And 6. The liability vacuum. Who is responsible when a biased decoder produces a misclassification? The clinician who relied on it? The vendor who sold it? The foundation model provider whose generalist model was fine-tuned to make it? Standard medical device liability law was not designed for this distribution of responsibility. The vendor often did not produce the foundation model. The foundation model provider did not validate the medical use. The clinician relied on the vendor's claim of validation. The result is that, when something goes wrong, accountability is genuinely unclear. The book argues for explicit statutory allocation of responsibility. Somebody has to be accountable, and the law should say who in advance. 6 failure modes. Each compounds the others. Chapter 55 takes us to what the book calls the new control challenge, the place where AI and neurotechnology, taken together, become qualitatively different. Quote, when the system that decides what you see, hear, and remember is the same system that reads how your brain reacts to what it shows you, the loop is closed. End quote. Let me describe how this loop works. 3 stages. Stage 1. Read. Wearable or implanted sensors detect attention, affect, comprehension state in real time. The system knows when you are bored. The system knows when you are excited. The system knows when you almost clicked but stopped. It does not need to know why. It only needs to know what. And the sensor revealing what is already in your earbud, or your watch, or the camera looking at your face. Stage 2. Predict. Foundation models translate the neural signal into predicted preference, predicted vulnerability, predicted likelihood of a chosen action. Not what you said you wanted. What your brain reveals you wanted, including things you would not say out loud. Including things you would not say to yourself. The model does not need access to your inner monologue in any deep sense. It needs only enough signal correlation to predict the next action. The bar for prediction is much lower than the bar for understanding. Stage 3. Modulate. Recommender systems adjust the input to move the predicted action closer to the desired one. And, increasingly, neuromodulators, devices that can shift attention or mood, close the loop on the output side as well as the input side. When recommendation engines learn from neural reaction, and when devices can intervene in neural state, the line between persuasion and manipulation is no longer where we thought it was. It moves to wherever the loop closes. Let me stop on that for a second. Persuasion has historically been protected. We protect speech. We protect advertising, with limits. We protect the marketplace of ideas. The protection assumes a model in which a persuader speaks and a recipient deliberates. The recipient's deliberation is the firewall, the moment at which the persuader's claim can be evaluated and accepted or rejected. What the closed loop does is bypass the deliberation. It optimizes directly against the predicted output of the recipient, without going through the recipient's evaluation. When the loop closes, persuasion has, in effect, been replaced with conditioning at the substrate level. The marketplace of ideas presupposes ideas in heads. If the system is no longer addressing ideas but addressing the apparatus that produces ideas, the marketplace metaphor breaks. This is not, in 2026, a hypothetical. The components exist. The integration is incremental. The book argues that this is exactly the place where cognitive liberty, the first of the 5 rights, has to get operational teeth. If cognitive liberty does not constrain closed-loop neural advertising, it does not constrain very much at all. Part 10. Society in the Neurotechnology Era. We have looked at what the technology is, what the law is, what the deployments are, and what artificial intelligence does to the picture. Part 10 asks the broader social question. What does life look like inside a society in which neurotechnology has been widely deployed without strong rights? 4 threads. The neuronal divide, a new kind of inequality. 3 specific pressure points: democracy, children, the workplace. And a working exercise: what rights are we willing to give up, and on what terms? Chapter 56 describes the neuronal divide. On one side, the cognitive halves. People with access to enhancement. Better focus. Faster recall. Mood regulation. Neuro-augmented learning. Premium pricing, mostly available to populations that are already advantaged. On the other side, the cognitive have-nots. People who either have no access, or, more often, only have access to surveillance-oriented neurotechnology. The wellness wearable mandated at a warehouse job. The attention tracking headband at a school in a low-income district. The fatigue monitor in a delivery vehicle. The worst of both worlds, the technology arrives in your life, but only in its tracking form, not its augmenting form. Fair access to enhancement is one of the 5 rights for exactly this reason. Without it, the divide hardens. It does not stay generational. It becomes heritable in everything but name, because enhancement compounds across childhood, across schooling, across early career formation. The book argues that fair access is the link between equality and neurorights. If you care about a society in which life chances are not predetermined, this is the right you should treat as load-bearing. It is the most easily ignored, and one of the most consequential. Chapters 58 through 60 describe 3 specific pressure points where social effects are concentrated. Pressure point 1. Democracy. Chapter 58. Neurodata-informed political targeting outdoes any micro-advertising strategy yet seen. Subliminal nudging, content engineered to operate below the level of conscious deliberation, and biofeedback-tuned content recommendation are not hypothetical. They are buildable today with off-the-shelf components. Free elections presume free interior life. If interior life is observable and modulable, the assumption that elections aggregate genuine preferences becomes harder to sustain. Constitutional doctrine on free elections, in every democracy, treats the voter as a deliberating agent whose vote is the considered expression of their judgment. If the judgment is being shaped, in real time, by content optimized against the voter's neural state, the doctrine still applies, but it applies in a much more complicated world. Some commentators argue that this is just persuasion at a finer grain. The book argues that there is a qualitative difference between persuasion that goes through the voter's deliberation and modulation that bypasses it. Democratic theory has to decide whether the difference matters. Pressure point 2. Children. Chapter 59. Developing brains in classrooms equipped with attention-tracking headbands. Marketed as personalized learning. Functions as the earliest possible onboarding to surveillance. Children cannot meaningfully consent. Their parents are often making decisions under pressure from school administrations. And the developmental dimension matters. We do not yet know what continuous monitoring of attention does to a developing brain's relationship with its own attention. When a child is told, every day, that their focus is being measured, that may itself shape how they learn to focus. The long-term outcome is genuinely unknown. The book argues for a high regulatory bar for any neuromonitoring device in an educational setting, opt-in only, with default privacy protections that cannot be waived for convenience. Parents who wish to use such devices should be able to. Parents who decline should not face educational consequences. Pressure point 3. The workplace. Chapter 60. Fatigue monitoring caps for truckers and pilots. Attention metrics in call centers. Stress sensors in open-plan offices. Most of the normalization of neurosurveillance in daily life is going to start at the workplace, because the employer-employee power asymmetry weakens consent more than any other relationship. If your employer requires a wearable as a condition of employment, your consent to wear it is shaped by the alternative, unemployment. That is not consent in the strong sense the law has historically demanded. The book argues for a series of specific workplace prohibitions. No mandatory neuromonitoring for any employment that does not have a documented safety case requiring it. Where safety cases do exist, pilots, surgeons, drivers, narrow, purpose-limited monitoring with explicit data minimization and short retention periods. Categorical prohibition on neural data use in hiring, promotion, or compensation decisions. These are concrete legislative asks. The book argues they should be on the docket of any labor committee in any legislature today. Chapter 57 contains a working exercise that I want to walk through with you slowly. Most rights infringements, the book observes, arrive not as conquests but as trades. Nobody comes to take your privacy. They offer you a deal. The deal is reasonable. You take it. Then the next deal is reasonable. You take it. After enough deals, the cumulative situation is not the situation you would have agreed to up front. This is how surveillance economies emerged. Nobody, in 1995, would have agreed to the level of behavioral tracking that exists today, if it had been offered as a single contract. It was offered as 100 separate contracts, over 25 years, each one in exchange for some specific service. The aggregate was never voted on. Neurotechnology is at exactly the same stage today as digital surveillance was around the year 2000. The 100 individual contracts have not yet been offered. They will be. Consider these. Each one, in isolation, sounds like a reasonable trade. Continuous focus monitoring in exchange for cheaper health insurance. Is that reasonable? Probably, if you trust the insurer, and if you have the option of declining without losing coverage. EEG-based entrance assessment in exchange for a faster job placement. Is that reasonable? Possibly, if the assessment is fair and if other candidates have the same option, and if the result does not follow you. Subliminal calming applied to your child in exchange for school discipline gains. Is that reasonable? You might think yes, if your child is suffering at school and traditional approaches have not worked. Closed-loop mood regulation in exchange for milder antidepressant medication. Is that reasonable? Possibly, especially if the alternative is years of medication side effects. Neural authentication in exchange for password-less banking. Is that reasonable? It might be very attractive, especially for people who have struggled with password management. Pause on each one. Each one looks reasonable. Each one might be worth it in isolation. Now imagine you take all 5. Your insurance is contingent on focus monitoring. Your job is contingent on EEG assessment. Your child is on subliminal modulation at school. Your mood is on closed-loop regulation. Your bank account opens with your brainwaves. What is left? Pause and think. What part of your daily life is not now reading your brain, writing into it, or both? The book's claim is that the cumulative effect is the erasure of the forum internum. Each trade is reasonable. Together they leave nothing inside that is not externally addressable. Notice what just happened. We started with 5 reasonable trades. We ended with a person whose entire inner life is, in one way or another, in commerce. And no single one of those steps would have looked unreasonable on its own. Each one was a yes. That is the structure of the problem. It is not a problem of bad actors making clearly bad offers. It is a problem of reasonable offers compounding to an unreasonable aggregate. Existing law, structured around the individual transaction, cannot easily see the aggregate. The book argues that neurorights must therefore be structural, not just transactional. There have to be some bargains, some configurations of consent, that are simply unavailable, that you cannot agree to, even if you would, because the cumulative shape would be incompatible with being a free agent. When advocacy work seems impractical or distant, remember this exercise. The fight is not against any one of these trades. It is for the boundary that says some trades are unavailable, even if you would take them, because the cumulative effect is incompatible with being a free agent. That boundary is what rights are for. Part 11. Who benefits commercially? We have talked about the technology, the law, the deployments, the rights at stake, and the social effects. Part 11 asks the question that often determines whether any of the above gets enacted. Where does the money go? A $7.3 billion private investment surge over the last decade does not arrive without market structure. And market structure, who supplies, who consumes, who concentrates, shapes regulation as much as regulation shapes the market. We are going to look at the players, the money flows, and the institutional couplings between civilian and defense procurement. Chapters 61 and 62bis give a snapshot of the neurotechnology market. $7.3 billion in private investment over the last 10 years, up from $331 million a decade earlier. 8 national brain initiatives: the United States, the European Union, China, Japan, South Korea, Israel, Australia, and others. More than 100 device makers and service firms catalogued in Chapter 62bis. But the trend is not fragmentation. The trend is concentration. Within 5 years, the book projects, a small set of foundation model decoder providers and a handful of device makers will likely supply most of the market. That has 2 implications. First, regulation has a few unusually leveraged targets. Get the standards right for the foundation model decoder layer, and you have shaped the practical capability of every consumer device that fine-tunes on top of it. Second, a few company-level decisions become disproportionately consequential. When the supply chain is concentrated, the corporate governance of a small number of firms determines what the technology can and cannot be used for. That makes both the regulatory and the civil society advocacy targets clearer. It also raises the stakes. If you only need to capture a small number of regulators or a small number of boardrooms to set the direction of an entire industry, the politics around those regulators and those boardrooms gets very intense, very fast. Chapter 62 introduces the major Silicon Valley players. I will go through each. Neuralink. High bandwidth, fully invasive cortical implants. The most watched program and, fairly, the most criticized. Engineering progress is real. The animal welfare track record has been subject to public investigation. The company's first human implants have been reported. What Neuralink represents commercially is the bet that fully invasive, high-channel count implants will be the dominant form factor for the next generation. That bet may or may not pay off. The signaling effect on the field, regardless, has been enormous. Synchron. Endovascular brain-computer interface. The device is threaded through blood vessels rather than implanted through open brain surgery. Patients are already using it for assistive communication. The medical risk profile is meaningfully different from a Neuralink implant. Synchron's approach is the strongest current competitor to the open brain surgery model, and it represents a different commercial bet that lower resolution but safer access will win the medical market first. Paradromics. High channel count implants targeting clinical applications. Quieter than Neuralink. Scientifically respected. Less interested in the consumer narrative. Worth knowing about. Paradromics represents the disciplined clinical-first approach. Less public attention. Less hype. More careful regulatory pathways. The book treats it as a model for what responsible clinical neurotechnology development can look like. Kernel. Non-invasive optical-based brain measurement. Has pivoted commercial focus several times. Illustrative of how commercial discipline is still being figured out in this space. Companies in this field are still searching for product-market fit. Pivots are common. The investor patience required is unusual. The book treats this not as a failure but as a sign of an immature market. Meta and Apple. Consumer neural input devices. Surface electromyography in wristbands. Nascent EEG and augmented reality glasses. The companies with the consumer surface area to make neurotechnology mainstream are the consumer electronics giants. Their entry shifts the market structure. When the company that ships 1 billion phones a year decides to put a neural sensor in the watch, the regulatory question changes overnight. The infrastructure for neural data collection becomes part of the default consumer electronics stack. This is the inflection point the book identifies as most consequential for the next 5 years. And, increasingly underneath all of the above, the foundation model laboratories. The decoder layer is moving toward generalist providers. That is the layer where governance leverage is highest. If you can establish standards at the decoder layer, bias audits, model cards, training data provenance, accuracy testing on diverse populations, you have, in effect, established standards for every consumer device that fine-tunes on top of those decoders. 6 categories of player. None of them, by itself, is the whole picture. Together they are the commercial substrate of the Neurorights conversation. Chapters 63 and 64 examine what the book calls the military-industrial neurocomplex. Defense procurement is where consumer neurotechnology research and development meets the largest unconstrained customer in the world. 3 braided money flows. Flow 1. Civilian research and development with defense end use. Dual-use research, funded for medical or consumer purposes, routinely produces a military-fielded variant. Export controls struggle to constrain software-defined capability, because the controlling code can be redistributed faster than the controls can be updated. Flow 2. Defense research and development with civilian spin-out. DARPA-funded work seeds private companies. Those companies then sell back to consumer markets. The result is a loop the public never voted on. A capability is developed at defense expense for defense reasons. It returns as a consumer product whose risks were not weighed in the original procurement decision. Flow 3. Venture capital coupling. Specialist defense and deep tech funds bridge the two worlds. They invest in companies that serve both customers. The book argues that this is where governance leverage is highest and currently weakest. Most public attention has gone to the implant story. The money flow that matters most for the long run is here, and it is much less visible. Most of the public debate misses it entirely. If you are an advocate looking for the highest leverage point of intervention, this is it. Part 12. The legislative agenda. We now move from diagnosis to prescription. What should the law do, specifically? Part 12 identifies 5 critical gaps in current law. It offers a model statute that legislators can adapt directly. And it sketches the architecture for an international neurotechnology treaty. If you remember nothing else from the next half hour, remember this. The book is asking the audience to do specific things: write to representatives, submit to consultations, work on civil society coalitions, and the model statute is the document the book wants those efforts pointed at. This is the operational core of the policy argument. Chapter 65 identifies 5 critical gaps in the current legal landscape. Let me name them and unpack each. Gap 1. Neurodata is not a defined data class in most jurisdictions. GDPR-style special category status is missing. Without it, sensitive brain data is treated like any other analytics stream, with the same default permissive flow that has produced the surveillance economy for everything else. The fix is in some ways straightforward. Amend existing data protection statutes to add neurodata as a special category, subject to heightened protections including a much stricter consent standard, mandatory data protection impact assessments before processing, and explicit prohibitions on secondary use. Many jurisdictions could close this gap with a single statutory amendment. Most have not. Gap 2. Consumer wellness is outside medical device law. The same EEG headset is a regulated medical device when sold to a clinic and an unregulated consumer product on an e-commerce platform. The risk to the user does not change with the channel. The regulation does. The book's recommendation here is straightforward in principle and politically hard in practice. Regulate based on the capability of the device, not the channel through which it is sold. If a device can capture neurodata, it falls under neurodata regulation. Period. Industry will resist this. Wellness sales are easier than medical sales. But the user's exposure is the same. The regulation should follow the exposure. Gap 3. Mental integrity has no concrete cause of action. Even where the right exists in principle, for example, in Chilean constitutional law, plaintiffs in most jurisdictions have no clear forum, no clear remedy, and no clear evidentiary standard with which to invoke it. The right is real on paper. It is unenforceable in practice. Closing this gap means constructing the cause of action. Standing rules. Evidentiary standards. Available remedies, damages, injunctions, declarations of right. Statutory presumptions where the evidentiary burden would otherwise crush the plaintiff. This is detail work, but detail work that has to be done. Gap 4. Cognitive liberty is not explicitly protected as freedom of thought. Article 18 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights was drafted before the technology existed. Interpretive updates from treaty bodies have not arrived in the form the technology now requires. The path here runs through the United Nations Human Rights Committee, which interprets the covenant, and through the Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Opinion and Expression. A general comment from the committee, addressing cognitive liberty explicitly, would do a great deal of doctrinal work. Gap 5. There is no international neurotechnology agency. The International Atomic Energy Agency exists for nuclear material. The Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons exists for chemical material. The equivalent for neurotechnology does not yet exist. Without one, treaty obligations have no inspection regime to make them real. Creating such an agency is a multi-year diplomatic project. It requires consensus on mandate, jurisdiction, funding, leadership. It will not happen in 2026. But the work of arguing for it has to start in 2026, because nothing of this scale arrives without years of advance argument. 5 gaps. The book argues that closing each of them is a feasible legislative project, and that doing so in the right sequence is the actual neurorights agenda for the next decade. The book also argues that these 5 gaps, addressed in their interaction rather than separately, would constitute a meaningful international floor, even before a comprehensive treaty arrives. Chapters 66 and 67 bis ask a structural question: at what level should neurorights live? The answer is, at multiple levels at once. Chapter 67 bis provides a complete ideal legislative stack, 6 tiers from supranational treaty to municipal rule. Tier 1. International treaty. A binding ban on neuroweapons. A baseline rights floor below which no state may operate. A treaty body with an inspection mandate. This is the apex. Tier 2. Supranational regulation, the European Union, eventually perhaps an African Union or other regional bloc. Regulation with extraterritorial reach over services touching the bloc, the same approach GDPR took with personal data. Tier 3. Constitutional. Mental integrity and cognitive liberty as enumerated rights in national constitutions. Chile's template. Tier 4. National statute. A comprehensive Neurorights Act. Definitions. Prohibitions. The special data class. The oversight authority. This is where the model statute in Chapter 67 sits. Tier 5. Sectoral regulation. Medical device rules. AI rules. Telecom rules. Education rules. The implementation detail that turns the statute into operational practice. Tier 6. Municipal. Bans on workplace surveillance. School device rules. The closest layer to daily life, and often the layer that is the easiest to win. No single tier is sufficient on its own. Effective rights live at the boundary between levels. A treaty without national implementation is words. A national statute without municipal application is unenforceable on the ground. The stack matters. The book's strategic claim is that advocacy should move on all tiers simultaneously, not pick one to focus on and hope it cascades. Chapters 68 and 69 make a call to 5 different sectors. Immediate, concrete action. To legislators. Adopt the model statute, or a version of it. Ratify the treaty draft once available. Close the wellness device loophole in your jurisdiction. To researchers. Adopt open standards for neurodata. Publish bias audits as a matter of normal practice. Refuse work for prohibited applications, the way the biological weapons community has refused for decades. To industry. Adopt a voluntary baseline before the mandatory baseline arrives. Make neurodata terms of use transparent. The companies that move first will not regret it. To civil society. Strategic litigation, where the constitutional rights already exist. Rights-framed public communication. Coalitions across communities that have historically not worked together, including, importantly, coalitions with the targeted individual community, which has often been excluded from neurorights advocacy. And to citizens, that is, to you. Information hygiene. Civic engagement. Local networks of solidarity. We will spend Part 16 on what each of these means in practice. Part 13. Oversight and governance. Rights without enforcement are aspirations. Enforcement without independence is theater. Part 13 looks at the institutional spine that turns a body of rights into a body of obligations. 3 threads. Independent neurotechnology commissions. Technical audit. Whistleblower protection. Each is a building block. None of them, alone, is sufficient. Together they are the operational machinery of neurorights enforcement. Chapter 70, with its companion 70 bis, proposes independent neurotechnology commissions. The model the book draws on is the Data Protection Authority, the kind of institution that exists in most European countries, and in many countries outside Europe, to enforce data protection law. But with much sharper teeth. 3 elements. Element 1. A statutory mandate. Standing investigation powers. Subpoena. Public reporting. Individual complaints jurisdiction. These are not optional features. They are what distinguishes a working oversight body from an advisory body. Element 2. Multi-stakeholder governance. Patients. Researchers. Ethicists. Technologists. Affected community representation, including representation from the targeted individual community. The composition matters. A body captured by industry interests is worse than no body at all. A body captured by regulators is just as bad. Both forms of capture have to be designed against. Element 3. Existing institutions plus new institutions. Wherever an existing data protection authority, an existing medical device regulator, or an existing human rights body can absorb the new work, do so. Where they cannot, and dedicated neurodata audit is one example, build a new agency. Don't multiply institutions for the sake of it. But don't shoehorn this work into bodies that are not equipped for it. The book's caution is against two failure modes. The first is the appointment of a commission that has no power. The second is the appointment of a commission that has power but is structurally captured. Designing against both at once is hard. It is also the work. Chapter 71 is about how technical audit actually works. 3 layers. Each requires expertise borrowed from a different discipline. Layer 1. Device-level audit. Hardware bill of materials, a published list of every component in the device, so that side channels and undisclosed capabilities cannot hide. Side channel testing, examining what the device can do beyond its declared function. Does the wireless chip emit on frequencies it shouldn't? Does the firmware respond to undocumented commands? Firmware reproducibility, given the same code, the same chip, the same conditions, you get the same firmware. This sounds technical, but it has a simple purpose. Reproducible builds make it possible for an outside auditor to confirm that the firmware running on the device is the firmware whose source code was published. Without reproducibility, every audit is a leap of faith. Radio frequency emissions profiling, what does this device transmit, intentionally and unintentionally? Routine audit and unscheduled audit. This is borrowed from the electronics certification world. The discipline exists. It can be applied here. Layer 2. Data flow audit. End-to-end inspection of where neurodata travels and what processing it undergoes. If a vendor claims differential privacy, you verify the claim. If a vendor claims anonymization, you stress test for re-identification. Re-identification testing is non-trivial. Neurodata is rich enough that even nominally anonymized datasets can often be linked back to individuals with surprisingly little auxiliary information. The vendor's claim of anonymization is, often, the most contestable claim they make. The auditor's job is to contest it. This is borrowed from financial audit, where money has to be traced through complex flows and the discipline is mature. Layer 3. Model audit. Bias testing on diverse populations. Reproducibility testing. Documented training data provenance. Red teaming for adversarial misuse. Bias testing means measuring the model's accuracy not just on average, but on every demographic slice that matters. Training data provenance means knowing where each example in the training set came from, with what consent, under what terms. Red teaming means hiring people to break the system on purpose, to find the failure modes before adversaries do. This is the newest and most contested layer. Model providers, especially foundation model providers, resist this kind of disclosure. They cite trade secrets. They cite competitive position. They cite, sometimes, the genuine difficulty of explaining what their own models do. Some of those objections are legitimate. The book argues that even legitimate objections do not justify regulatory exemption. The model provider can disclose what they have to disclose under appropriate confidentiality regimes. The point is that the disclosure happens, even if the public does not see the full detail. But model audit is where regulatory leverage now matters most. The other 2 layers, hard as they are tractable. Model audit is the frontier. The book argues for treating it as a regulatory priority, not a future research project. And one final point. The audit triangle works only when all three layers are independent. If the same firm audits the device, the data flow, and the model, the audit is not independent. The book argues for separation of audit functions, different auditors at different layers, to prevent the kind of capture that has bedeviled financial audit. The lessons of financial audit history apply here. They should be applied early. Chapter 72, Whistleblower Protection. Quote, most of what regulators will learn about neurotechnology misuse will come from inside the laboratories and companies that build it. Strong whistleblower protection is not a side topic. It is half of detection. End quote. 3 requirements. Requirement 1. Legal protection from retaliation. Civil and criminal penalties for employer retaliation against whistleblowers. Standing for reinstatement and damages, so that the whistleblower can recover. Hard limits on non-disclosure agreements that obstruct disclosure to regulators. NDAs cannot, in any responsible regime, prevent disclosure of illegal activity. Requirement 2. Channels that work in practice. Confidential reporting directly to the Neurotechnology Commission. Independent legal counsel made available before the whistleblower has to commit. Secure, technically competent intake so that what the whistleblower brings can be understood, preserved, and acted on. Requirement 3. Cross-border protection. The industry is global. The protection has to be global. The book proposes treaty-level minimums for whistleblower protection, plus asylum pathways for at-risk technical whistleblowers in jurisdictions where retaliation is severe. If you ask why a chapter on whistleblowers belongs in a book on neurorights, this is why. The information that allows the rights to be enforced lives, much of the time, inside organizations with strong incentives to keep it inside. Designing the channels that let it out is part of designing the rights themselves. Part 14. The future, 3, 5, 10, and 20 years out. We have now seen what the technology is, what the law is, what the deployments are, what enforcement might look like. Part 14 asks where this is going. For horizons. 2029. 2031. 2036. 2046. And, alongside the timeline, a geopolitical analysis, how neurotechnology reshapes power. I will note, these are not predictions in the strong sense. They are scenarios. The book uses them as a tool for thinking about where forks in the road appear, and what the world looks like from the other side of each fork. For horizons. Chapters 73 through 76. 2029. The tipping point. Consumer brain-computer interfaces become mainstream. The first major neurodata breach hits public consciousness. The European Union plus 2 or 3 large states adopt comprehensive frameworks. Public attention shift, complete. This is the year, in the book's reckoning, when neurorights stop being a specialist conversation and become a general public conversation. The breach is, in the book's projection, the proximate cause. A major company will, at some point, lose a substantial neurodata corpus to either accidental disclosure or malicious breach. When the public learns that millions of people's emotional and attentional profiles are now in the wrong hands, the conversation will shift. It is worth doing the policy work in advance, so that when the moment arrives, the response is informed and proportionate rather than reactive and excessive. 2031. The regulatory race. Treaty negotiations open. Industry self-regulation is overtaken by binding rules in leading jurisdictions. Strategic litigation reaches the highest courts. The Chilean approach is exported. The European approach hardens. The American patchwork shows its strain. The race is between jurisdictions that move first and jurisdictions that move late. The early movers shape the global default, the same way the EU shaped global default privacy through GDPR. The late movers inherit a framework they did not write. The political incentive for legislators in early mover jurisdictions is unusually well aligned. Getting in early gives you a disproportionate voice in the global outcome. 2036. The neuronal divide. Cognitive haves and have-nots become visible in everyday life. Enhancement is normalized in white-collar sectors. Equality framing dominates politics. The neurorights conversation joins the conversation about inequality at the center of policy debate. By this horizon, we are no longer arguing about whether neurotechnology has social effects. We are arguing about distribution. The question shifts from quote, should this exist unquote, to quote, who gets access, on what terms, with what protections unquote. That is a different kind of political fight. It has its own institutional infrastructure. The book argues that the infrastructure that will be useful at this horizon has to be started now. 2046. The transhuman era. Persistent brain-computer interface use across a meaningful share of the population. The framing question shifts from quote, who owns my brain data unquote, to quote, who governs the augmented self unquote. This is the horizon at which today's Neurorights work pays off, or fails to, depending on how well we used the years before it. 2046 is 20 years from now. Most of the people in any current legislature will be retired or close to it. The policy choices made in 2026 and 2027 will be inherited by people who did not make them, in a world whose technology will look almost unrecognizable. The book argues that the gift current legislators can give to future legislators is a framework that does not have to be reinvented from scratch. The framework being built today is, in a real sense, the inheritance for that future legislative cycle. For horizons. The book treats them not as forecasts but as planning aids. When you write a policy memo today, the question is, which of these worlds does this policy make more or less likely? Chapter 76 bis adds the geopolitical layer. How does neurotechnology reshape power between states? 4 shifts. Shift 1. Strategic competition. Neurotechnology becomes a vector of state rivalry. Export control regimes evolve, slowly. New plurilateral groupings form around standards, the way semiconductor governance has produced new alignments. Shift 2. Alliance reconfiguration. A rights-based bloc forms, opposed to a capability-first bloc. Middle powers, Brazil, India, several European Union members, Indonesia, South Africa, become decisive swing voters. Many of the most consequential treaty negotiations will turn on which way the middle powers go. Shift 3. Asymmetric attribution. Cheap, deniable cognitive operations favor weaker states and non-state actors. Attribution doctrines lag capability. The result is destabilizing, accusations are easy, proof is hard, and escalation dynamics get worse. Shift 4. New rights diplomacy. Targeted individual cases become subjects of international human rights protection. Neurorights enter UN treaty body jurisprudence. The case law builds. This is the slow but important shift, the construction of a body of international human rights doctrine specific to neurotechnology. The way doctrine has built up around the rights of children, the rights of refugees, the rights of persons with disabilities. Treaty bodies, court decisions, special rapporteurs. 4 shifts. Strategic. Alliance. Attribution. Doctrinal. The geopolitics of mind. Part 15. What top-secret knowledge likely exists. We are now going to enter the most contested part of the book. The author handles it carefully. So will we. From culture to the present. A historical trace of state research into neuroinfluence. And, as a separate chapter, the specific case of synthetic telepathy, how plausible it is, when it might mature, and how it should be constrained. Part 15 distinguishes documented history, sourced from declassified records and public domain documents, from speculative current capability. The book does not overclaim. We will not either. Chapter 77 gives a brief history from culture to the present. Some of the most disturbing material in the book is also the most thoroughly sourced. Public domain government documents. Declassified files. Confirmed contemporary reporting. The book separates documented history from contested current claims. Let me walk through it. 1950s through 1970s. Culture. CIA run. More than 150 subprojects. Drug experimentation, including involuntary administration of LSD to unwitting American citizens. Sensory deprivation. Hypnosis research. Senate investigated by the Church Committee in 1975 and 1976. Records partially destroyed by then-director Richard Helms before investigation. What survived was sufficient to confirm that programs had been run involving informed consent violations on a large scale, with research on subjects ranging from prisoners to psychiatric patients to members of the general public. If you ever doubt that the topic of state research into mind influence is a real historical topic, the Church Committee record is your starting point. 1970s through 1990s. Soviet psychotronics. State-run programs in influence and behavioral modification. Declassified materials exist. Independent academic surveys of the publicly available record exist. Assessing the technical effectiveness of these programs is, at this distance, very difficult. Some of the published claims do not survive technical scrutiny. What is established is that the programs were funded, were staffed, and were taken seriously by the Soviet state apparatus for decades. 2000s and 2010s. Post-September 11th. Enhanced interrogation programs. Neuroscience-informed influence operations. Public investigation of this era is incomplete. The Senate Intelligence Committee report on torture, often called the Feinstein Report, is the most thorough public document, and it is heavily redacted. The full executive summary was finally released, in nominal form, in December 2014. The underlying body of the report remains classified. What is public is enough to establish the existence of the programs. What is classified would tell us their scope. 2020s. Present. DARPA N3. Similar programs in other powers. Civil-military fusion strategies in China, in particular, make the boundary between civilian research and military application moot. A peer-reviewed Chinese neuroscience paper today may have, as its authorship, a researcher whose laboratory receives both academic and military funding, and whose conclusions will inform both clinical practice and defense procurement. That coupling is explicit Chinese state policy. It is not a secret. Continuous thread. From the 1950s to today, there has been an unbroken pattern of state-level research into the technological influence of the mind. Some of it has been incompetent. Some of it has been ineffective. Some of it has been unethical. And the public has, only at intervals, learned what is actually being done. The pattern of disclosure is itself worth attention. Each major disclosure, the Church Committee, the Feinstein Report, happened only because individuals inside the system chose to bring it forward, often at significant personal cost. Each disclosure was followed by reform, partial reform, then drift. That historical record is one of the reasons the book argues for whistleblower protection and inspection regimes that do not rely on voluntary disclosure. Voluntary disclosure, in this domain, has been the exception over 70 years. It would be a mistake to design a future system that depends on it being the rule. Chapter 78 takes on the specific case of synthetic telepathy. Synthetic telepathy, the bidirectional transmission of structured cognitive content, language, imagery, instruction, between brains, with or without a remote technological intermediary. The book gives synthetic telepathy its own chapter because it concentrates every single Neurorights concern into one technology. Before we go further, a definitional note. The book is careful to distinguish synthetic telepathy in this technical sense from the cultural connotations of the word. We are not talking about magic. We are not talking about innate human powers. We are talking about an engineered closed-loop system in which one brain's neural state is encoded, transmitted, and decoded into another brain's neural input. When primitive forms, sender classification of imagined words decoded and presented to a receiver, are at laboratory scale already, in published research. Robust, between strangers, real-world capability is most plausible mid-2030s. But laboratory is not field. Closing the gap requires power, latency, robustness, and social acceptance. Capability is not deployment. We have to keep that distinction clear. What it threatens. Every write at once. Privacy, the receiver is read into. Integrity, the receiver is written into. Continuity, the recipient's self-model is altered by content sourced from another mind. Discrimination, only some people can refuse, those with the resources to opt out, those whose context permits refusal. And cognitive liberty, the inner forum becomes externally addressable. This is the maximum risk case. The 5 rights, considered separately, were each significant. Synthetic telepathy puts all 5 in play at once. How to constrain. Treaty-level prohibition on non-consensual use. Mandatory device-level attestation of consent state. The device cryptographically asserts that the user has consented. Recording unaudit obligations for any consent-based use. Hard caps on research authorizations. A bright line. Not a sliding scale. Let me explain why the book argues for a bright line in this case rather than risk-benefit balancing. Risk-benefit balancing presupposes that, in principle, the technology can be deployed responsibly given the right balance of risks and benefits. The book's argument is that synthetic telepathy, deployed at scale, fundamentally changes the structure of human social relations in ways that cannot be balanced, because the change is structural, not transactional. Once minds are addressable by other minds, even with consent, the option not to be addressable becomes a costly choice. The default normalizes. The social texture changes. That kind of structural change is what bright-line prohibitions are for. Not because the technology can never have legitimate uses, but because the equilibrium of widespread deployment is, on the book's view, incompatible with the rights framework. The book's view is that synthetic telepathy is not a technology to manage on a risk-benefit basis. It is a technology to draw a hard prohibition around in advance, while there is still time to do so. Precaution, the book says, that does not retreat. And a final note. The book is not saying that synthetic telepathy will be achieved by 2035. It might not be. The book is saying that the architecture of the prohibition has to be in place before, not after, the capability question is resolved. If we wait to find out, we will be deciding under pressure from the technology rather than from first principles. The first principles work has to happen now. Part 15 bis. Hypothetical cases, 15 fictional stories. After the abstract argument, the book offers a teaching device, 15 short fictional scenarios. Civilian. Warfare. Covert. And future technology cases. Each case is followed by legal commentary distinguishing what existing law already covers from what new doctrine would need to address. The cases are designed for use in workshops, in classroom settings, and in policy briefings. They are short. They are concrete. They are deliberately uncomfortable. We are going to look at 5 of them, one from each category, to give a flavor. I will mention the chapter number in the book for each so you can find the full text later. 5 illustrative cases. Let me walk you through each. Civilian Case 1. The employer wearable, set in 2027. A logistics firm makes a focus tracking headband mandatory for warehouse workers. A worker with consistently lower attention scores is dismissed. The legal question: where does labor law meet neurorights? Existing labor law does not have a category for neural performance metrics. Existing privacy law does not cover the wearable channel cleanly. The case sits in a doctrinal gap. The book asks what the right cause of action would be. Sit with this one. It is not science fiction. Variants of it already exist. Fatigue monitoring devices in long-haul trucking and aviation are routine in some jurisdictions. The principle is the same. The only question is whether the standard is informed and proportionate, or whether it is set by whoever ships first. Civilian Case 2. The Schoolchild EEG, set in 2028. A public school district adopts attention monitoring devices system-wide. Apparent objects. Question: what is the standard for consent on behalf of a developing child whose own consent is not legally controlling? Existing education law has procedures. Existing children's rights law has principles. The neurotechnology dimension makes both more contested. The book's legal commentary on this case argues that the standard cannot be parental consent alone. There has to be a presumption in favor of the child's developmental privacy that requires more than parental sign-off to overcome. The child's interest, separately considered, is part of the analysis. Warfare Case. Drone pilot BCI teaming, set in 2032. Drones operated by military personnel through brain-computer interface. International humanitarian law's distinction principle, combatants versus civilians, comes under strain when the human operator is mediated by a closed-loop neural system. Whose judgment made the strike? Who is the responsible commander? The question is not academic. The book's commentary works through the responsibility chain. The pilot, the closed-loop systems manufacturer, the integrating commander, the doctrine writer who authorized the use. International humanitarian law presumes a human decision at the moment of the use of force. When the human decision is mediated by neural state-conditioned automation, the doctrine becomes harder to apply. The book argues for explicit doctrinal updates to preserve responsibility even as the mediation deepens. Covert case. The untraceable behavioral nudge, set in 2030. A sustained, low-intensity influence campaign across a population. No single attributable actor. How does attribution doctrine catch up with operations designed to be unattributable? Existing tort law assumes you can name a defendant. Existing international law assumes you can identify a state. The book proposes a doctrine of collective responsibility for systemic influence at scale, analogous to environmental law's approach to diffuse harm. If the harm is real and the actor cannot be individually identified, the legal response cannot be silence. Some doctrine has to apply. The book sketches what it might look like. Future technology case. The memory rewrite trial, set in 2034. Therapeutic memory modification is offered to victims of trauma. The treatment works. But, where does consent stand when the memory of consent itself is what changes? This is not a technical question. It is a philosophical question with technological force. The book's commentary is the most speculative of the five. It argues that the consent regime for memory-modifying interventions has to be different in kind from the consent regime for other medical interventions, because the post-intervention person may relate to the consent differently than the pre-intervention person did. The book proposes layered consent, repeated, externally witnessed, with reconfirmation at intervals, as the analytical starting point. Each case is paired with legal commentary on what existing law already does and what gaps remain. A teaching device, the book calls it, as much as a thought experiment. The cases are deliberately designed for use in workshops, in classrooms, in policy briefings. If you teach this material, the cases are the working materials. They are the part the book wants in circulation. Part 16. A practical toolkit for citizens. We have come a long way. We have looked at the technology, the law, the deployments, the rights, the ethics, the market, the legislative agenda, the oversight machinery, the forecasts. Now we get practical. Part 16 is the part of the book that the author treats as the most important to put into action. The work of defending neurorights is the work of ordinary citizens at the scale of daily life. Not only of legislators, scientists, and activists. Of citizens. If you take only one thing from this lecture into your week, take it from Part 16. We are going to spend real time on it. Chapter 79 offers a toolkit for the concerned citizen. 4 practices. I want to take each one slowly. These are not exhortations. They are concrete habits. Practice 1. Information hygiene. Treat any wearable that touches the head as a sensor, not as a feature. Read the terms of service before you pair the device. Pause. Read. I know, nobody reads terms of service. The book's response is that you should read them for the head-touching devices. Make that the line. Not for every service. For the devices that can read your brain. Default to off. Allow the minimum permissions needed for the function you actually want. Revoke when done. Don't leave a device with continuous monitoring permissions running because it's convenient. Continuous monitoring is, almost always, the configuration the vendor wants. It is, almost always, more than you need. The default should be off. The exception should be the active session. Practice 2. Civic engagement. Write to members of the European Parliament. Write to your Member of Parliament. Write to ministers. Submit comments to public consultations. They are read. They are counted. They make a difference. A single coherent written submission to a regulatory consultation is, in many jurisdictions, given more weight than dozens of petition signatures. If you can write 300 words, you can affect a regulatory outcome more than most lobbying organizations think possible. Show up at municipal hearings on workplace technology and on school technology. Those are the hearings where actual policy gets shaped, locally. Local hearings are usually underattended. A handful of informed citizens can change the outcome. This is where the marginal hour of civic time pays the highest return. Practice 3. Learn one thing well. Pick one part of the book and become a local resource on it. The legal landscape. The technology. The ethics. Communities need translators between the specialized debate and the people whose lives it will affect. They do not need more generalists. Pick what interests you most. Read deeply. Be willing to say I don't know when you reach the edge of what you have learned, but be the person who knows what's on this side of the edge. Practice 4. Mutual aid before crisis. Build the network before you need it. Local groups. Listening circles. Contact lists. Networks built in a calm moment outlive any single campaign. Networks built in an emergency rarely survive the emergency. This is the practice most people underweight. The civic infrastructure that will be useful in 2030 does not get built in 2030. It gets built now, slowly, by people willing to show up to small meetings with no immediate payoff. 4 practices. None of them require special expertise. All of them require sustained attention over time. That is the toolkit. The work is regular, durable, civic. Most of the meaningful Neurorights work of the next decade will look like this. Not heroic. Persistent. The persistence is the point. Chapter 80 offers specific guidance for affected individuals, for people who believe they may have been subjected to non-consensual neuro effects. Whether or not any specific case will one day be vindicated, contemporaneous documentation is the single most useful action an affected person can take. I want to slow down here. This chapter is one the book wants in the hands of every person who identifies as affected, regardless of whether their case is ultimately judged technological in origin. The procedures are sound advice whatever the underlying cause. 3 steps. Step 1. Record. Maintain a timestamp log. Symptoms. Conditions. Location. Duration. Audio and video where possible. Witnesses where available. No editing of past entries. Once an entry is made, leave it. The integrity of the record depends on this. Chain of custody from day 1. If you have any inclination toward perfectionism, fight it here. The point is not to produce a beautiful record. It is to produce a contemporaneous one. A messy log made in real time is far more valuable, legally, than a polished one written after the fact. Step 2. Preserve. Multiple copies in multiple locations. Cloud and local. Country and country. Hash the files at intervals. A cryptographic hash creates a fingerprint that proves the file has not been modified since the hash was generated. Use RFC 3161 timestamping, or an equivalent blockchain anchor, for tamper evidence. These are not exotic procedures. They are normal evidence handling. The book wants affected individuals to adopt them as a matter of routine. And the book is realistic. Most affected individuals do not have access to the technical advice needed to do this well. That is one of the things documentation collectives, which we will discuss next, exist for. The procedures need to be standardized, taught, and made accessible. Step 3. Share carefully. Trusted clinician. Trusted advocate. Trusted legal advisor. Avoid public airing of details that could compromise privacy or future investigation. Don't conflate venting with reporting. The two are different acts, with different purposes, and they should not be combined. Selective. Structured. Paced. There is a temptation, when one feels disbelieved, to broadcast more loudly to more people. The book gently advises against this. Broadcasting widely does not, in practice, produce belief. It often produces the opposite. Selective sharing with people equipped to engage seriously is, in nearly every case, the better strategy. The book is direct about this. Documentation is not a guarantee of vindication. It is the precondition for the possibility of vindication. Without it, even a true case has no path through the legal system. Read in another way, this advice is also therapy in the literal sense, it offers structure. People reporting these experiences are often overwhelmed. Procedure can be steadying. The discipline of a timestamped log, kept faithfully, has its own settling effect, regardless of where the case eventually goes. The book does not present it that way. But many people who have used the procedures report that effect. Chapter 81, Building Local Networks of Solidarity. The most consistent finding in the testimony we discussed in Part 5 is isolation. The most consistent recommendation in Part 16 is the opposite, structured, durable local networks. 3 forms, complementing each other. Form 1. Listening circles. Small. Recurring. Low stakes. Not therapy. Not advocacy. A place where being heard is not a victory, but a baseline expectation. Most people can take on the role of facilitator after a single weekend of training. This is the first node in the network. Form 2. Advocacy chapters. Coordinated outreach to local councils. To regional authorities. To members of parliament and parliamentary committees. One well-prepared written submission beats 50 unfocused complaints. The discipline of preparation matters. This is the civic node, the part of the network that interfaces with formal political institutions. Form 3. Documentation collectives. Shared, governed corpora of accounts and supporting material. Standards for collection. Standards for anonymization. Standards for access. What TI1 Voice is trying to be, at scale. This is the evidentiary node, the part of the network that preserves the record. Listening, advocacy, documentation. 3 nodes. Each kind of node has a role. None of them is the whole picture. What the book is asking for, in this chapter, is that affected individuals and their allies build all 3 forms in their localities, and let those local networks join up into a national and international fabric over time. The book's view is that this is how rights become real on the ground. Not from a single national campaign, but from 1,000 local nodes that share work. Part 17. Conclusion, the choice before us. We are nearly at the end. Part 17 is short. It is also the part the book wants the reader to carry out of the room. 2 sections. The choice before us, Path A or Path B, rights precede deployment, or deployment precedes rights. And a call to action, concrete steps for this week, this month, this quarter, this year. I will read both. I will let the second one in particular sit with you. The book is not making an abstract argument. It is asking you, specifically, to do things starting on Monday. Chapter 82. The choice before us. Let me read the central passage. Quote, "The human mind is a frontier worth defending. The technologies challenging that frontier require legal and ethical infrastructure that does not yet exist. The construction of that infrastructure is among the most consequential civic projects of our time." End quote. And the book frames the choice as a fork in the road. Path A, rights precede deployment. A small, deliberate window, 3 to 5 years, in which legislatures, courts, and treaties get ahead of the technology curve. The window does not stay open by itself. It stays open because the people who care about it keep it open. Compare this to other moments in technology history. The privacy framework for personal data was built 2 decades after personal data started being collected. The framework arrived late. It is still struggling to catch up. The world we live in today, on data, is largely Path B world, deployment first, rights afterwards. We are living with the consequences. Many of those consequences are not the ones we would have chosen if the choice had been made in advance. Path B, deployment precedes rights. Capability is built, normalized, and embedded before rights catch up. Each later attempt to roll the deployment back faces sunk cost arguments. The infrastructure already exists. The jobs already depend on it. The user base is already there. The legal and political work of restraint becomes much harder after the deployment than before it. Think about the air pollution from leaded petrol. Think about asbestos. Think about industrial-scale tobacco. In each case, the harms were eventually recognized, eventually mitigated, eventually constrained. But the cost of the late response, measured in lives, in illness, in remediation expense, was enormous. The cost of late response in neurotechnology would not be measured in respiratory disease. It would be measured in something less reversible. This is the choice. The choice is not whether neurotechnology will exist. It will. The choice is whether the framework of rights is in place when it arrives, or arrives years after it has settled in. Different worlds, on either side of that fork. Different freedoms. Different sets of expectations about what is possible to be. And, this is the harder truth, there is no neutral choice. Not choosing is a choice. Continuing as we are continues us down path B. The world will not pause to let us decide. The book's argument is that, on present trajectory, path B is the default outcome. Path A requires active effort. The window for that effort is, in the book's estimate, 3 to 5 years from now. After that, the case law and the infrastructure begin to lock in. Some doors close. They will not reopen for the price they would have closed for now. Chapter 83. A call to action, what you can do this month. The book is specific. Let me read each item, because each is meant to be done. This week. Read your country's current data protection law. Search the document for the word neurodata. Note its absence. Almost certainly, the word is not in the statute. The fact that the word is not in the statute is the start of an advocacy conversation. This week, also. Audit one wearable you own. Read its privacy policy. Decide whether you keep using it after you have read what you have agreed to. This month. Write a 300-word email to one elected representative. Reference Chile, 2021, the Constitutional Amendment. Reference UNESCO, 2025, the Recommendation on the Ethics of Neurotechnology. Ask, specifically, what your representative's position is. This month, also. Identify one local group already doing related work, digital rights, privacy, disability rights. Show up at a meeting. Many of the coalitions that will carry the Neurorights agenda already exist. They are waiting for the people who care about this topic to join them. This quarter. Pick one chapter of the book and learn it well enough to explain to a non-specialist friend over coffee. Pick the part that interests you most. Learn it deeply. Become a local resource on it. This year. Help start, or sustain, a local listening circle or a local documentation collective. The civic infrastructure that will defend these rights does not exist yet in most places. It will exist where someone chooses to start it. 6 commitments. None of them require permission. None of them require qualifications. All of them, taken together, are how the rights become real. Before we close, a workshop. 5 questions to take with us. We will not answer these in the room today. They are for you to carry. Question 1. Where in your own life is neurotechnology already present, even if it is not labeled as such? Look at your wearables. Look at your earbuds. Look at the devices your employer has issued. Question 2. Which of the 5 core rights do you think is most fragile in your country, today, and why? Cognitive liberty. Mental privacy. Mental integrity. Psychological continuity. Fair access. Some will be more vulnerable in some jurisdictions than others. The honest answer for your country is the start of your advocacy strategy. Question 3. Where does the book's treatment of the targeted individual phenomenon strike you as most careful, and where most contestable? Sit with that question. The phenomenon is the pressure test of the whole framework. Your honest answer matters. Question 4. Of the 6 legislative tiers, international treaty, supranational regulation, constitutional amendment, national statute, sectoral rule, municipal rule, which one do you think is the most leveraged in your context for the next 5 years? Which one will produce the most rights gained per unit of effort invested? Question 5. What is one concrete action from Chapter 83 that you are willing to commit to before this session ends? Not a wish. Not a vague intention. One concrete action. With a date. Carry these 5 questions with you. The answers are not in the book. The answers are in your context, your community, and your choices. That is, in a real sense, where this work begins. Thank you. Thank you for attending. Thank you for engaging. And, in advance, thank you for the work that begins after this room empties. A few resources to take away. The book, Neurorights, The Battle for the Last Private Place. The expanded 4th edition. Published in 2026. The project, TI One Voice, at one.witisk.org. The book is part of a broader initiative, and the initiative welcomes participation. 3 key public documents are worth reading in full. The United Nations Human Rights Council Report, AHRC 57-61, from 2024. The most thorough international analysis to date. The UNESCO Recommendation on the Ethics of Neurotechnology, adopted in 2025. The first Global Ethical Framework. And the Chilean Constitutional Amendment of 2021. Short. Concrete. The pioneer text. The author is Stefan van der A.A., in Brussels. I want to close with one thought. The next 2.5 hours we have just spent together are not the work. The work is what happens between now and the next conversation like this one. Read your country's data protection law this week. Audit one wearable. Write to one representative. Find one local group. Pick one chapter of the book and learn it well. Help start, or sustain, a local network. If even a fraction of the people who attend a session like this one go on to do those things, then this is the moment when the window of the next 5 years stayed open. Thank you. Take care of yourselves. Take care of each other. And we will see you on the other side of the work.